Have you ever felt the weight of time pressing down on you? A slow, certain pressure you can't escape? That was autumn in the Middle Ages. Not the golden, warm season story is often told. No gentle cider, no crackling hearth fires to sit beside in comfort. Hey, I'm really glad you're here. How's your day going? Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I imagine someone listening to this while relaxing, maybe winding down for the night or just looking for something calm to keep them company. If you're into quiet, calm and boring history that helps you slow down or even fall asleep, I hope you'll stick around, and if you feel like it, please consider subscribing. It seriously helps the channel grow and keeps me motivated to keep making more content like this. Alright, back to the story, because autumn back then wasn't just a season, it was a warning. Autumn was cold wind biting at your fingers, your hands are cracked and raw from work. A season wrapped not in celebration, but in urgent necessity. The harvest deadline was the heartbeat of the village. It was the measure by which every day was judged. A countdown that couldn't be paused or ignored. Every task mattered. Every root pulled, every grain gathered, every bundle of firewood stacked was not traditional ritual. It was survival, because when winter came, and it always came, there would be no more growing, no fresh fruit or vegetables, no warmth without firewood, no second chances. You pulled the roots from frozen earth with stiff, aching fingers. You didn't do it because it was custom or habit. You did it because if you didn't, you wouldn't eat. Not in the way we think of eating today, but eating enough to keep the cold at bay, to hold off the gnawing hunger, to keep the children alive through months of frost and snow. Outside, the fields were a flurry of activity. Men swung scythes in rhythmic arcs. Their movements were weary but relentless. Women stooped low, gathering bundles of wheat and barley. Their breaths rose in white clouds in the chill air. Children ran between rows, carrying baskets heavy with grain. Eyes were wary of the wolves that sometimes roamed near the woods. Most villagers did not own the land they worked. They were tenants, bound to fields they rented from a lord, a monastery, or the crown itself. This meant that the harvest was not theirs alone. They owed taxes, tithes, to their landlords. Not just a portion of their grain, but labor on the lord's lands, firewood, and sometimes even the best animals. Even if the harvest was meager, the tax was fixed. There was no leniency in bad years, and so after the lord's share was taken, the villagers gathered what remained. What was left had to last through a long, harsh winter, sometimes 5 months or more, of frost, hunger, sickness and silence. No shops to buy food from, no markets to replenish supplies, only what had been saved, preserved, or hidden away. If the grain spoiled, if it was stolen by mice or rats, or if the vegetables rotted in damp cellars, that loss would be felt deeply and painfully in the months ahead. It would be felt in January's empty bowls, in March's thinning bodies, in the brittle bones of those too weak to carry on. In the background of every autumn chore was last winter. The winter when the cow died, the only one who gave milk to the children. The winter when the uncle coughed through Christmas and never saw spring again. The winter when the snow came early, burying the fields before the harvest could be brought in, or when it melted too soon, then froze again, leaving the ground hard and unyielding. The poor kept track of time by memory. They didn't mark days with calendars or clocks. They measured years by hardships and losses. How bad was the year with no hay? How thin did the soup stretch the year the mill flooded? How many candles were burned for children lost to sickness and cold? You don't need a calendar when hunger writes itself into your body. And so, autumn was a quiet kind of panic. Not loud, not chaotic, but steady, like the cold creeping under a cracked door. A dread passed down through generations, learned from the old stories told by the fireside, seen in the eyes of those who had endured one winter too many. You didn't speak of it. You didn't give it a voice. You simply kept working. because no one knew how hard the next winter would be, only that it was coming, and that it always found what you had forgotten. The firewood stack was only half built. The sky was already darker than it should be, and the first frost was waiting, patient and unyielding. As the sun sank lower each day, the rhythm of the village slowed. The long hours of sunlight, when hands could work freely, shortened into brief pale moments of brightness. Twilight came early, and with it the cold. Families gathered their children indoors, wrapped in whatever clothes and blankets they had. The warmth of the sun was already slipping away, and with it the fleeting sense of safety. In the homes, smoke from the hearth curled upwards, thick and heavy, filling the small rooms with the smell of soot and burnt wood. It was a smell tied to survival, a reminder that the fire was a fragile shield against the dark, cold outside. Outside, the last of the crops were bundled and stored. Potatoes, turnips and cabbages were taken from root cellars and piles in the fields. Each tuber, each sack of grain was precious. Each was counted and recounted. There was no room for waste, no luxury for excess. Each morsel saved was a promise to the months ahead. And yet, even in this urgency, there was a strange kind of beauty, a rhythm to the work, quiet companionship in shared toil. Children learned the tasks young, carrying bundles, tending animals, gathering kindling. They learned that the seasons were not just weather but life itself, that the land was both provider and adversary, and as the harvest came to an end, there was a pause, a moment between the endless labor and the long winter wait. They said a good woodpile was the difference between life and death, not because it promised warmth or comfort, but because it meant you might have enough. In a medieval village, wood was never just wood. It was fuel, yes, but also a lifeline, a precious, fragile thread tethering you to survival through months of cold and dark. And like all lifelines, it came with a price, a cost measured in sweat, risk, and time. The work of gathering firewood was not just a task of autumn, it was a year-round labor that gained urgency as the leaves fell and frost crept across the fields. You needed dry wood. Split, stacked carefully and kept off the damp earth. Protected from rain, but never sealed too tightly. Wood that could breathe, but stay ready to burn. For the poorest families, the choice of fuel was limited. They burned twigs snapped from brambles, old fence posts salvaged from decay, and if luck was scarce, they burned dung, animal dung collected and shaped into sun-dried cakes. It didn't burn clean or bright. It left thick black smoke, curling like fog through the tiny homes. Its smell lingered long after the fire had died down, but it was something. Chopping firewood was work that demanded strength and care. One wrong swing could crush a finger or tear flesh, yet the work had to be done, no matter the pain. But the greatest danger wasn't the axe, it was the forest itself. In much of medieval Europe, the forest wasn't a gift of nature, it belonged to the lord. Every tree, every branch was his property. Collecting wood was governed by strict laws. You could gather estovers, certain types of wood in certain was for certain uses. But cutting down a tree without permission, breaking a branch in the wrong place, those offences could bring harsh punishments. A fine, if you were lucky. Whipping, if you weren't. Even prison or worse. There are records of peasants losing fingers, maimed not by accidents, but by cruel punishments, for stealing wood to keep their families alive. But Cole doesn't care about the forest law, doesn't wait for courts or pardons. When the nights dipped below freezing, desperation grew. You might hear the sudden, quick chop of a hidden axe deep in the woods, a sound that vanished as quickly as it came, or the quiet scrape of branches dragged through the underbrush in darkness. In the morning, the village might wake to a notice posted on the church door, a fine for wood theft. Or worse, one neighbour might simply disappear for a while, gone to hide from the Lord's men, or to find wood in forbidden places, and everyone pretended not to see, not because they approved, but because they understood the truth too well. Even when you had wood, starting a fire was never simple. There were no matches or lighters, no convenient tools to spark a flame instantly. You had flint and steel, and dried moss, straw or feathers to catch the tiny sparks. On damp days, it could take hours. The smoke would fill the house, thick and acrid, because chimneys were a luxury, rare and expensive. Most peasants lived with a central hearth beneath a smoke hole in the roof, or simply an open fire in the middle of a dirt floor. The air was heavy with soot and smoke. Your eyes watered constantly. Your clothes, your hair, the walls, everything smelled of blackened wood and ash. But the fire had to keep burning. Even a poor, smoky, sputtering fire was better than none at all, because letting it die meant starting over, and wasting precious kindling you might not have. That's why villagers stared at their hearths so often, not just for warmth, not just for cooking, because the fire meant hope. It meant the children might sleep through the night. Their bodies warmed against the chill. It meant you could boil water, cook the meager food you had, and keep sickness at bay. For a few hours, it meant the cold stayed outside, beyond the walls, beyond the door, even if your hands were cracked and bleeding, even if the smoke burned your lungs, even if the wood was nearly gone. Because few fears run deeper than the fear of freezing, and in a winter like theirs, no one was ever truly warm. The weight of the woodpile was more than physical. It was a burden carried in memory and hope. Each log stacked with care was a promise made to the family, a promise that they would see the thaw, that they would greet spring alive. But wood rots and stacks collapse. Rain and snow can soak the best-laid piles. Every year, the firewood reminded villagers how fragile their survival truly was, and how much depended on their labor, on their vigilance, on their courage. The woodpile was a silent witness to all that was lost, and to all that was still fought for. Warmth in the Middle Ages wasn't a given. It wasn't something people expected. It was a hard-won victory, something you fought for every day, with what little you had. And when winter arrived, when the cold dug deep into bones and breath, the clothes you wore were more than fabric. They were the thin line between cold and something far worse. Most people, especially those living in the countryside, owned very few clothes. Maybe 2 sets at best, one worn every day, and one saved for feast days, when there was a reason to dress better. But when winter came, you didn't simply change clothes, you layered them. You wore everything you owned all at once. Even if the clothes didn't fit quite right, even if they smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, even if you had worn the same garments for months without washing. Wool was life. But not the soft, cuddly wool you might imagine today. It was coarse and scratchy, oily from lanolin barely cleaned or processed. And it itched, sometimes unbearably. Wool was heavy, especially when wet, but it trapped air, and that trapped air, that thin layer between your skin and the biting cold, might just keep your fingers from freezing. Sheep were everything to a village. They gave wool for clothing, milk for food, and manure for fields. Sometimes they were eaten, but rarely, because their value was far greater alive. And so the wool trade was central. Even the poorest village might have a spinner, a weaver, a dyer, someone who could card raw fleece into yarn, and turn yarn into cloth. But this work was slow and delicate. Spinning took hours, even days. Weaving took longer still, and much of it happened by firelight, in cramped, dim huts on the darkest winter days. Underneath everything, if you were lucky, you wore a linen shirt, clean if you were lucky, washed maybe once a month. Over the shirt, a wool tunic, and over that, cloaks, shawls, mittens if you had any. Or strips of cloth, wrapped, tied, patched together again and again. Shoes were a privilege. Many peasants went barefoot, even in the frost. Others had leather boots, but leather cracked and broke when soaked and frozen. So boots were stuffed with straw, old cloth, moss, anything to keep feet from freezing. Legs were wrapped in thick woolen bands like oversized socks tied tight with twine. Still, feet froze. There were no down jackets, no insulated fabrics, just layers and movement. Because if you stopped working, the cold would creep in. If you got cold, sickness was not far behind, and if you got sick, you might not get better. So when you see old paintings of peasants, bundled head to toe, hoods pulled tight, hands tucked deep into sleeves, know this: that wasn't comfort, that was survival. Clothing in the Middle Ages told stories of wealth or the lack of it, of care and neglect. of weather and hardship, of love. Because every patch sewn onto a cloak, every thread mended under flickering candlelight, was a silent vow from someone who didn't want you to freeze. Warmth was borrowed from the fire, from the flock of sheep grazing in distant fields, from the body pressed close beside yours. And still, it was never enough. Food in the Middle Ages didn't simply run out. It didn't disappear all at once like an empty pantry door swinging open. Instead, it ran thin. It faded slowly, day by day, week by week, with a quiet, relentless precision. It spoiled in the dark corners of cellars, curled up in the shadows. And in the coldest weeks of winter, you felt every mistake made back in the autumn, every missed opportunity, every stolen hour, every stolen root, every grain spilled. Winter food wasn't about meals, it was about portions, about quantities carefully measured and guessed, and about the impossible balance between what you might need and what you could afford to lose. Because in a medieval village, there were no supermarkets, no delivery carts bringing fresh bread or salted meat, no markets bustling in winter, no trade caravans with fresh produce. There was only what you had grown, what you had traded for in the warmer months, and what you had hidden away, buried in cellars or stored in pantries, before the frost came and sealed the land tight. Grain was the backbone of survival. Wheat, rye, oats, dried and stored carefully in sacks, sometimes woven of coarse hemp or flax. But even grain had enemies. Mice, the tiny, persistent thieves of winter. Mold, a silent, creeping enemy that turned golden kernels to black and sour mush. And moisture, the cold breath that turned food to rot. Too much of any of these, and your food could turn to dust beneath your hands. So grain was stored high off the ground, in racks or shelves, sometimes smoked dry with fragrant pine or juniper boughs, sometimes prayed over. You might find a knot in the sack, tied tightly with a whispered prayer, a silent wish for protection against loss. Bread was the constant, but winter bread, it wasn't fresh or soft like the bread of spring or summer. It was made from older grain, sometimes coarse, sometimes bitter, sometimes stretched with peas or beans or acorns when the harvest had been poor. You didn't complain. There was no other choice. Flour was a precious commodity, and if the river froze or the mill's wheels stopped turning, there was no flour. No flour meant no bread. No bread meant hunger. Salt was the key to preservation. It dried meat, saving it from decay. It preserved fish caught in the rivers or seas, salted and layered carefully in brine. If you were lucky, you might have a side of bacon hanging above the fire. The rich smell of smoked pork filled the cold air. But for the poor, roots, beans, dried peas and lentils were the mainstays. Foods that lasted, that didn't rot if stored right. Yet, even so, by January, the cellar grew quieter, the sacks were lighter, and you began counting every mouth at the table. The word for this wasn't diet, it was rationing. And it wasn't optional, you ate less, because the food had to last. Some winters were harsher than others. Some years, people boiled bark from trees to add a faint flavor to their meager soups. Some years they boiled grass, hoping to coax something edible from the earth beneath the snow. There were tales, whispered and feared, of soup made from stones, bones, or nothing at all. In the worst winters, some simply didn't eat. Preservation wasn't just clever, it was sacred. Apples were dried on strings, their skins shriveled but sweet. Cabbage was stored in barrels, pickled and fermented to last the cold months. Turnips and carrots were buried in sand or straw, deep in the cellar, insulated from frost. Milk was turned into hard cheese that could be stored long-term. Butter was salted heavily, kept in crocks to slow spoilage. Every preserved food was a small miracle. And when all else failed, you prayed. Because famine wasn't just an idea, it was a memory. That year when the snow came early and never left. That year when the mill flooded and no flour was ground. That year when the rats gnawed through every sack and the Lord did nothing. Hunger lived just beneath the surface. It haunted the corners of your pantry. It breathed down your neck when you ladled thin soup into your children's bowls. Every meal became a negotiation between now and March. Between I'm full and I'm alive. There's a kind of cold that doesn't stay outside. It slips beneath doors like a shadow, creeps through the cracks in walls, a ghost of winter that settles deep inside your clothes, your breath, your very bones. And in a medieval house, that was winter, not something you escaped, but something you lived with. Most villagers lived in cottages like this, small, simple, and built with what they had. Timber frames, walls were made of wattle and daub, a patchwork of woven sticks, coated with a sticky mud mixture. A house held together by little more than mud and hope. Roofs were thatch or sometimes turf, heavy, insulating in summer, but barely enough in winter. Floors were dirt, swept clean with bundles of branches or straw. No insulation here, no glass in windows, only wooden shutters if you were lucky. Blankets? Rare and threadbare. Curtains? Luxury beyond reach. The hearth was the heart of the home, not just a place for warmth, but life itself. You cooked on it, dried your clothes on poles above the flames, kept animals warm at night so they might survive the frost. But a fire doesn't warm a room, it only heats the center. The edges stayed cold. You learned to live with that cold, to work in it, to sleep in it. Beds were usually shared, not just for space, but for warmth and survival. Parents, children, grandparents, all tucked under the same rough cloth and straw mattress. Still, you'd wake with frozen toes, frost might form on the inside of the walls overnight, your breath would hang heavy in the air, clouding the dark, your clothes would stiffen from the cold. Water in a bowl near the door might freeze solid by morning. Animals sometimes slept inside too, a chicken in a corner, a goat in the shadows, even a cow if you were fortunate enough to have one. Not just for warmth, but to keep the animal alive. Space and warmth were shared, because firewood was precious, and letting the hearth go cold, that was like inviting death in for tea. But homes weren't just cold. They were dark, windows were tiny, mere slits cut into the walls to keep out drafts. Glass was rare and expensive, so daylight crept in only faintly, or not at all. Most of the day was shadow. Smoke from the fire curled upward, swirling into the rafters. Most homes didn't have chimneys, only a small hole to let smoke escape. So it hung thick, blackening beams, filling lungs, burning eyes. Children grew up breathing soot. Adults coughed through whole seasons. No one called it indoor air quality. It was just life. It's easy to forget how much the body adapts to discomfort, to dimness, to cold, until you realize what it means to live in a house where the wind talks to you through the walls. And yet, people made homes out of these spaces. They hung herbs from the rafters to dry, carved spoons and bowls by firelight, told stories that carried through long, cold nights, prayed, grieved, loved, not because the home was warm, but because it was theirs, and sometimes that was enough. In the cold, harsh winters of the medieval world, sickness was a shadow that never fully left your side. It wasn't just an unfortunate visitor. It was a constant threat looming over every breath you took, every cough you heard, every fever that gripped a loved one. People didn't understand disease as we do today. There was no germ theory, no doctors with microscopes or antibiotics. No clean running water to wash away illness. No central heating to keep the chill from settling deep in your chest. Instead, illness was a mystery wrapped in fear and whispered stories. When someone fell sick, the question wasn't why, but rather when, and who will be next. The cold itself was brutal, but it also left people vulnerable, weakening bodies, slowing recovery, making every cough, every fever, every wound harder to fight. And when you didn't have medicines or knowledge, what you had was hope. Sometimes that hope was fragile, barely enough to hold on to. Medicine in these villages was a patchwork of memory, folk belief, and religious faith. Healing was never a certainty, just a mixture of small acts meant to keep the sickness at bay. People turned to herbs, sage, horehound, mugwort, tied to old knowledge passed down through generations. They believed these plants could ease fevers, calm coughs, or ward off evil spirits thought to cause illness. Some homes had bundles of dried rosemary hung above beds, thought to purify the air. Others would bleed the sick, cut the skin to let out bad blood. Garlic and vinegar might be fed to a fevered tongue, thought to fight infection. But mostly, people prayed. They prayed to saints who were believed to protect the sick. Saint Sebastian, the patron against plague, Saint Roch, invoked for all manner of sickness. Saint Apollonia, called upon when teeth ached so badly they threatened death itself. Every village, every family had its own stories and remedies. Maybe your grandmother swore by yarrow to bring down a fever, or your family insisted no one should die without a candle burning near their bed to guide their souls safely to the next world. Coughing in the night might mean your house was cursed, or simply too cold. When illness worsened, explanations turned darker. If a child's fever burned too high or an old man began coughing blood, the rational gave way to the supernatural. The evil air was blamed, a miasma that floated unseen through the village. Witchcraft was whispered about behind closed doors. Bad omens and sins not confessed, seen as punishments for moral failings, even envy from a neighbor. The jealous eye that could curse you without a word. When knowledge ran out, fear filled the cracks. A spilled jar of herbs on the floor could be read as a sign. A crow calling 3 times might foretell death. A bad dream remembered at dawn might mean you were marked. Illness in winter wasn't just physical, it was haunted. It was punishment, it was a warning, or sometimes just the cruelest fact of life. There were healers, midwives, and wise women who knew which herbs to gather, how to prepare poultices, and who to pray to. They helped as best they could, but they were also watched with suspicion, feared when something went wrong. Respected but isolated, because in the deep cold, when death came, people needed someone to blame. Death in winter wasn't rare, it was expected. Every cough, every rattle, every prolonged silence was the beginning of something worse. Not just plague, the shadow of that terror never fully disappeared, but the simple things we now take for granted. An infected tooth left untreated, a swollen joint from frostbite, a cough that rattled until it stole breath. Burials happened quickly, before the earth froze too hard to dig, before the air grew thick with the stench of decay, and then the living retreated inside, back to their dim, drafty homes, to whisper fears, to pray, to hope the sickness would stop there. When the fields finally froze under their blanket of frost, and the sun's warmth seemed to retreat for good, the rhythm of life shifted. The work slowed, not because there was nothing to do, but because the land no longer needed tending. The plough rested, the soil lay silent beneath ice and snow, and the endless demands of planting, weeding, and harvesting paused until another year. But the slow season was no rest. You had more time, certainly, more hours in the day that didn't have to be spent outside, but it wasn't leisure. It wasn't a vacation from hardship. It was a different kind of time, a time you had to fill carefully, without wasting precious fuel or food, and without letting your mind unravel in the suffocating silence. Inside those dark, drafty homes, hands stayed busy. There was always something to mend, a basket with a broken weave, a torn cloak, a tool that needed sharpening or repairing. If you were lucky enough to have wool, it was spun and woven endlessly by firelight, turning raw fleece into the thin, scratchy cloth that would be your armor against the cold. Nets had to be knotted tight, leather softened and oiled, seeds sorted and saved carefully for the next planting season. Even as the chill bit through walls and into bones, stillness was dangerous. Sitting idle was a luxury no one could afford. But not all work was practical. Much of it was quiet survival. The survival of the spirit. Stories were told, songs passed down, and games played to fill the long hours. Children listened with wide eyes to tales spun by grandmothers and elders. Stories of saints who braved impossible odds, miracles that defied the bitter cold, and the hidden magic of winter itself. Other stories were darker, filled with witches, wolves, and restless spirits said to roam the frost-bitten forests and moors. Not always meant to frighten, these tales gave shape to the silence. Because winter was so full of silence, no birdsong, no clattering tools, no laughter carried across the fields, just the low, constant whisper of the wind outside, the soft crackle of the fire, the quiet breathing of bodies huddled together against the cold, and the occasional cough that echoed too loudly in the stillness. You learned to make your own rhythm in that silence. Morning prayers whispered over steaming cups of weak herbal tea, watching the fire as it burned down to embers, coaxing it back to life again and again. Waiting. Always waiting for the wind to change, the ice to soften, the sun to return. People marked time however they could. Some lit candles, letting the wax drip to measure hours slipping by. Others carved notches into doorframes or beams, each scratch a silent record of survival. Many watched the moon's slow passage, hoping for the thaw that would bring new life to frozen fields. But sometimes time simply blurred. Was it Tuesday or Friday? Was that last bundle of firewood from yesterday or the week before? The cold made days bleed together, each indistinguishable from the last. On occasion, you might risk a visit to a neighbour, trading stories, a bit of salt, or simply silence, sharing warmth in the cold. Or you might make your way to the village church if the roads were passable through the snow. Even the cold stone church, with its draughty windows and echoing halls, was a refuge, a place where voices other than your own could be heard, where prayers were spoken aloud in unison. This part of winter, the slow, quiet, dim stretch, was often forgotten in stories and songs. It was days spent in shadow, the hours marked only by candlelight and breath, waiting for heat, for sun, for green. There were few stories to tell during these times, but the fire still burned. You still sat close to it, still listened to the voices around you, still tried in every way possible to be warm. And sometimes you were.
Winter in the medieval village wasn't just a season, it was a test, not just of strength or endurance or skill, but of the human spirit itself. The bitter cold outside seeped into bones and minds alike, but it could never fully reach the spark that lived inside each person's heart. When the world was a frozen silence, the warmth of human connection became everything. Families gathered close, often too close for comfort, under rough wool blankets, sharing what little warmth they had. It wasn't just to fend off the cold, it was to remind each other, silently, without words, that they were not alone, that they mattered. In homes like these, every breath, every heartbeat was a quiet victory. The struggle to keep going wasn't just about survival, it was about love, about preserving the fragile thread that tied one generation to the next. The village itself was a living organism, knit tightly by shared hardship. In summer and autumn, neighbours might pass each other on the road with little more than a nod. But in winter, those few exchanges became lifelines. If the snow was shallow enough, you might visit your neighbour's hut for a short while, to trade a little salt pork for a handful of dried herbs, to swap stories or prayers, to remind each other that, even in the darkest months, the world was not entirely silent. The church was the heart of this gathering, the one place where the village's scattered warmth could pool. Though the stone sanctuary was cold and the wooden benches hard, it was full of life in winter. Candles flickered, voices rose in hymn, and the priest's words offered both comfort and strength. Here, faith was a weapon against despair. The promise of resurrection, the hope of spring, the mercy of saints, all wove through prayers spoken aloud and silently, carried like a gentle fire through the long months. But outside the hearth of the church, winter dragged on, slow and relentless. Days folded into one another, each much like the last, stretching time thin. The cold made movement difficult, even breathing seemed harder. Inside the huts, life was both lived and endured. Children, restless and bright even in the gloom, learned early to find small joys. The sparkle of frost on a window, the thrill of a whispered story, the warmth of a shared cloak. Elders sat by the fire, their faces maps of winters past, their stories filling the room with echoes of better days and hard lessons. They were the village's living memory, reminders of survival, of hope, of the seasons that always turned. Yet with every frozen dawn came the ache of waiting, waiting for the thaw, waiting for the sun's return, waiting for the fragile green shoots to break the snow.
This waiting was heavy. It pressed down on hearts like the cold pressed on skin. It tested faith, patience, and resolve. Not all hearts made it through unscathed. Winter was a season of sorrow as much as survival. Families lost children to fevers that no one could cure, to colds that settled deep in the lungs, to wounds that festered without care. Funerals were hurried. The frozen ground could not wait for long. Graves were shallow, marked simply, and the names whispered into the wind. Grief was a shadow that stretched long across the cold months, a quiet companion to every meal and every prayer. But even in grief, life found a way forward. New births brought fresh hope, and the resilience of love gave strength to those left behind.
It's easy to overlook the extraordinary in the ordinary. But surviving a medieval winter was itself a kind of heroism. Every day spent spinning wool by dim candlelight, every meal carefully rationed and shared, every story told to keep spirits alive, these were acts of courage. There was no glory, no fanfare, only the quiet determination to face the cold, the hunger, the dark, and to carry on. People learned to read the subtle signs of spring in the lengthening light and the song of the earliest birds. They celebrated these small promises, a crocus pushing through snow, the thaw of a frozen stream, with gratitude that was fierce and deep. Hope was the true hearth of the medieval winter. It was carried in the hands that held kindling, in the hands that held children, in the hands that passed loaves of bread and whispered blessings. Hope was the stubborn flame that no storm could extinguish. It was the promise whispered in the stillness that this cold, hard season was only temporary, that beneath the ice life waited and would return. And when the thaw came, slow and sure, it was more than a change in weather, it was a renewal of everything. If you think back to the hardest winters you've known, moments when the cold wasn't just outside but inside too, you know what it means to keep a fire burning. Not just in the hearth, but in your heart. Because that's what the medieval villagers taught us, that even in the longest, darkest cold, there is warmth to be found. And even when everything feels frozen and still, life is quietly waiting to bloom again. Thank you for walking through this winter with me. I hope you'll still be here when the next stories are ready to be told, when spring arrives and new chapters unfold. Until then, keep that fire burning in your heart and know that every season holds its kind of hope. Now, let's talk about how darkness governed medieval life. It started slowly, not with a storm or a sudden blackout, but with a few lost minutes. At first it was just earlier shadows, then came the colder wind, a long dusk that crept in before the chores were done. Chickens roosting too soon, children were called in while the sky still held a little light. And then, before anyone realized it, the days were over by late afternoon. In the Middle Ages, light wasn't background noise. It was a boundary, a lifeline, a permission slip. When the sun disappeared, so did almost everything else. A medieval day was not structured by the hour, it was ruled by the sun. Church bells rang not because it was 3 p.m., but because the shadows told them so. People rose at first light, ate their heaviest meal before midday, and tried to finish whatever work they had long before darkness took over. There was no controlling it, no switch to flip, no lamp to click on, no soft LED glow waiting in the corner of a bedroom. The sun was the clock, the watchman, and the taskmaster. And once it dipped below the horizon, you were at the mercy of the dark. If you lived in a medieval village, you knew that when the sun set, the road stopped being yours. Shops closed, not because the merchant was tired, but because no one could see. Blacksmiths stopped working, farmers came inside. Bakers ended their kneading and tucked their coals away to keep them from dying overnight. Even the churches, usually the last to go dark, shuttered their doors. Once night fell, life didn't just slow down, it ceased. The world outside your door faded into a space you no longer owned. Here's what you didn't do. You didn't travel. You didn't work in the fields. You didn't go to visit anyone, unless it was urgent, and even then, you brought others. You didn't wander without reason. You didn't stay out without a light. You didn't trust the road, because beyond the candlelight, the forest paths and village lanes turned into something else. Something unlit, unknown,
and that was enough. In cities, the danger might have been thieves. In rural places, it was wolves. But everywhere there was fear. Fear of falling, fear of getting lost, fear of something waiting in the dark. Night was heavy in a way that's hard to feel today. It wasn't just that it was dark. It was long. In the dead of winter, some parts of Europe saw only 8 hours of daylight. That left 16 hours to sit, sleep, or endure the night in silence. Now, let's talk about how darkness governed medieval life. It started slowly, not with a storm or a sudden blackout, but with a few lost minutes. At first it was just earlier shadows, then came the colder wind, a long dusk that crept in before the chores were done. Chickens roosting too soon, children were called in while the sky still held a little light. And then, before anyone realized it, the days were over by late afternoon. In the Middle Ages, light wasn't background noise. It was a boundary, a lifeline, a permission slip. When the sun disappeared, so did almost everything else. A medieval day was not structured by the hour, it was ruled by the sun. Church bells rang not because it was 3 p.m., but because the shadows told them so. People rose at first light, ate their heaviest meal before midday, and tried to finish whatever work they had long before darkness took over. There was no controlling it, no switch to flip, no lamp to click on, no soft LED glow waiting in the corner of a bedroom. The sun was the clock, the watchman, and the taskmaster. And once it dipped below the horizon, you were at the mercy of the dark. If you lived in a medieval village, you knew that when the sun set, the road stopped being yours. Shops closed, not because the merchant was tired, but because no one could see. Blacksmiths stopped working, farmers came inside. Bakers ended their kneading and tucked their coals away to keep them from dying overnight. Even the churches, usually the last to go dark, shuttered their doors. Once night fell, life didn't just slow down, it ceased. The world outside your door faded into a space you no longer owned. Here's what you didn't do. You didn't travel. You didn't work in the fields. You didn't go to visit anyone, unless it was urgent, and even then, you brought others. You didn't wander without reason. You didn't stay out without a light. You didn't trust the road, because beyond the candlelight, the forest paths and village lanes turned into something else. Something unlit, unknown, and that was enough. In cities, the danger might have been thieves. In rural places, it was wolves. But everywhere there was fear. Fear of falling, fear of getting lost, fear of something waiting in the dark. Night was heavy in a way that's hard to feel today. It wasn't just that it was dark. It was long. In the dead of winter, some parts of Europe saw only 8 hours of daylight. That left 16 hours to sit, sleep, or endure the night in silence.
That's why people huddled near the hearth. It wasn't just warmth, it was witness. If something happened to you in the dark, an illness, a fall, a scream, being near others meant you wouldn't be alone. It's also why firelight had a sacred feeling. It didn't just illuminate, it reassured. It pushed back the edge of the void, just enough to feel like the world still existed outside your door. Before mechanical clocks were widespread, monasteries governed time. The monks were often the only people tracking the passage of hours, marking out the canonical hours with bells and chants. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, compline. The bell would ring even in the middle of the night, sometimes in total darkness. For the rest of the population, time was felt through changes in the sky or the behavior of animals. But in monasteries, the rhythm of prayer replaced the rhythm of daylight. And still, even there, darkness was not something they challenged. They endured it, just like everyone else. Today, if it gets dark, we flick on a switch, we scroll our phones, we keep moving. But in the Middle Ages, you stopped moving when the sun did. That's hard for us to understand. We're used to extending the day as long as we want, staying up past midnight, binge watching, reading, texting, gaming, working overnight shifts. We've trained ourselves to override darkness. But for most of human history, darkness overrode us. Of course, not everyone suffered the dark equally. The wealthy could stretch the day, if only a little. Castles and manor houses might have torches fixed to walls, braziers to light larger halls, and more rarely beeswax candles. These burned cleaner, brighter and longer than the tallow rushlights of the poor. But they were expensive, A single beeswax candle could cost what a labourer made in a day. So even in manors, candlelight was rationed, used with care, reserved for meals, prayer, or essential tasks. A well-lit room wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a show of power. Light meant money, light meant status, light meant choice, and if you didn't have it, you went to bed. It sounds strange today, but in the Middle Ages, people often went to bed, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing left to do. No books to read, no devices to scroll, no lights to keep working by. You might talk quietly for a while, eat a final piece of bread, say your prayers. Beta says, but unless you were wealthy or working a night watch, the dark decided for you. You rest now. But there were those who had to be out. Night watchmen patrolled city gates. Shepherds tended flocks through the dark. Monks rose before dawn for prayers. Midwives walked in silence toward homes where a mother was in labour. For them, the dark was more than an inconvenience, it was a risk. With no street lighting, even familiar paths could turn treacherous. Holes, ice, uneven ground, or a wrong step could leave you stranded, injured or worse. In some towns, night watchmen would shout the hour and the weather. 3 o'clock and all is well. A reminder that someone was awake. Someone was watching, but most nights you heard nothing, to sit in the dark alone, with only the fire and your thoughts. Beta says, it wasn't just boring, it was a kind of slow unravelling. Medieval people were not less afraid than we are. If anything, they were more so. Most believed in the devil, in witches, in restless spirits, in signs and omens. Bitter saith the dark was where these things lived. That's why people hung crosses, painted protective symbols above their door, or whispered prayers before bed. Not just for health, not just for forgiveness, but for safety through the night. You didn't fear the sun going down, you feared what came next. And yet, in that silence, some found peace. They watched the fire burn low. They listened to the night birds, the soft hooves of passing animals, and the occasional sound of a neighbour coughing through a thin wall. They reflected, or mourned, or wondered, because night was a space where time slowed. So slowly, it nearly stopped. And when the fire burned to embers, when the last rushlight hissed out, you lay back, eyes open in total blackness, and waited for sleep to come. Or for the sun, whichever arrived first. The return of light wasn't just about warmth. It was proof that you'd made it through the dark, that the wolves hadn't come, that the sickness hadn't worsened, that the bad dream you couldn't explain hadn't followed you into daylight. Morning was a small triumph. The glow of the hearth rekindled, the rooster's cry, the slow pale blue blooming through cracks in the shutters, is all meant life continued. You survived the night. And in the Middle Ages, that was never guaranteed. At first, light came in quietly, soft and grey. You could just make out shapes in the room, the faces of others, your own breath in the cold air. Then the fire was stirred, the first chores began. Bread was broken, animals stirred, and soon the village came back to life. Chickens clucked, hooves echoed on muddy roads, voices returned. The dark hours were folded away again, like a blanket you didn't ask for but had no choice but to use. Even after the sun rose, darkness lingered in the body, in the routine. You moved more slowly in winter, slept longer, talked less, worked harder to stay warm. There were fewer meals, fewer smiles, more waiting. And while the light returned each morning, the season reminded you it wouldn't stay for long. Darkness would come again that evening, just as deep, just as complete. But for now, there was a window to be opened, a path to be walked, a pot to be stirred over the fire. Life resumed, quietly, carefully, as if darkness had ears. In the Middle Ages, people didn't conquer the dark. They respected it, endured it, shaped their lives around it, because night was a fact of life, not a flaw in the system. They learned to pause, to listen, to retreat inward. They understood something we've largely forgotten. That time doesn't always need to be filled. Sometimes it only needs to pass. It's easy to romanticize candlelight. In stories, it's warm, flickering, gentle. A glow that softens shadows and invites you to lean closer. We think of wax-dripped desks, parchment letters, quiet readers tucked in libraries. But
In the Middle Ages, candlelight wasn't a comfort, it was a compromise, a desperate, smoky attempt to push back the dark. For most, it wasn't even a candle at all. Real candles made from beeswax were a luxury, clean-burning, sweet-smelling, and long-lasting. They were used in churches by nobility and occasionally by wealthy merchants, but the poor? They used tallow, rendered animal fat. Tallow candles sputtered, they smoked, they stank. The smell of burning fat filled the home, coating the air and the walls in a greasy film. They burned unevenly, they dripped, they sometimes went out for no reason. And when you ran out, there were no backups. You sat in darkness. Even cheaper than a tallow candle was the rushlight, a thin stalk of dried rush plant dipped in tallow and left to harden. Imagine a fat-coated twig that burned like a primitive wick. It didn't provide a strong flame. It burned quickly, often lasting less than an hour. It bent, it dripped. Sometimes it broke entirely before finishing. Still, for the poor, it was better than nothing, used sparingly and placed in crude holders, sometimes just stuck between stones or balanced against a piece of iron. The light they gave? Weak, yellow, a flicker at best. But in total darkness, a flicker could feel like hope. In many homes, candles were rationed. One for the whole evening. One to last several nights. Families planned their evenings around how long they could keep a single flame alive. Children learned early not to waste a candle, no letting it burn unattended, no using it to light a second unless it was needed. Some villages used communal candles for events or emergencies. Monks in scriptoria might use oil lamps or carefully guarded beeswax tapers, but always with discipline. Candles were not for mood. They were in need. Any light you did have came with a price. Open flame was dangerous. In cities, it was common for homes to be packed close together. A dropped rushlight could mean the loss of a street. Entire neighborhoods burned in a single night, with nothing to stop the flames once they took hold. That's why many cities had curfews, not just for people, but for fires.
The cover fire ritual, couvre-feu in Old French, instructed people to extinguish or cover their hearths before bed. This is where the modern word curfew comes from. The fear wasn't just losing light, but as lean, it was losing everything. In medieval homes, light was a treasure to be handled with care. Imagine a small family gathered around a single tallow candle or a rushlight perched precariously on a rough iron holder or wedged between stones. That tiny flame was their window to the world beyond the deepening dark. The flickering glow did more than just show shapes. It created a fragile stage where shadows danced on walls of timber and plaster. Faces blurred in and out of focus, features softened and sharpened with every wavering flicker, and the corners of rooms disappeared into a veil of nearly impenetrable blackness. Because the flame was so weak and so precious, every night was carefully choreographed. Fine tasks requiring sharp vision, like sewing intricate patterns or sharpening tools, were often left for daylight hours. Instead, people worked on simple, repetitive chores that could be done by the dim, unreliable light, mending a torn garment, spinning wool into thread, and preparing food that didn't need precision. Most evenings were quieter. Families sat together, talking softly or simply listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional murmur of the wind outside. The weak light invited restfulness and enforced slowing down that sometimes gave space for reflection, storytelling, or prayer. Night was not for productivity. It was for conserving energy and waiting for dawn. Candlelight in the Middle Ages came with a heavy price beyond its cost. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, produced a thick, greasy smoke that clung to everything inside a home. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning fat, and the black soot coated the walls, ceilings, and faces alike. Over months and years, the darkened interiors of homes were stained not just by age, but by this constant, smoky haze. The scent lingered on clothes and skin, mixing with the smell of wood smoke from the hearth and the earthy odors of livestock nearby. It was a smell medieval people accepted as part of daily life, a reminder of the struggle against darkness and the small comforts they could afford. Unlike the clean, nearly scentless light of modern candles, these flames filled rooms with a tangible presence, both comforting and oppressive. The smoke made the air heavy, sometimes causing eyes to water or lungs to ache.
but extinguishing the candle meant plunging back into the terrifying dark. In the trembling glow of a tallow candle or rushlight, the mind played tricks. Shadows leapt unpredictably on walls, stretching and contracting as the flame flickered in an uneven rhythm. Familiar objects sometimes appeared twisted or alive, as if moving just beyond your sight. In a world steeped in superstition, these shadows were not merely visual distortions, they were doorways for fear. The medieval imagination was rich with stories of spirits, witches, and demons that prowled in the dark. The half-light, neither fully bright nor completely dark, became a liminal space where the veil between the physical and supernatural felt thin. Parents whispered warnings to their children, telling them to stay close to the fire or risk being taken by mysterious forces lurking in the shadows. Ghost stories were born from these moments, faint noises in the house, a sudden chill, or a fleeting shape glimpsed in the corner of the eye. The flickering candlelight wasn't just illumination, it was a fragile shield, barely holding back the unseen terrors of the night. With so little reliable light, nightfall was an enforced pause, a mandatory retreat from the world. People learned to accept that once the sun dipped below the horizon, the day's work was over. There was simply no way to carry on with meaningful tasks. This shaped medieval culture deeply. The routines of daily life revolved around the availability of light, and the psychological weight of darkness influenced the collective mindset. Night wasn't a time for achievement or creativity, it was a test of endurance, patience, and faith. Families used these long, dark hours for quiet companionship, prayer, and rest, but also for fear and uncertainty. The limited light made the unknown larger, and the dark hours felt endless. Today we take light for granted. A single bulb can flood an entire room. Our screens glow steadily, and we can summon bright illumination with a flick of a switch. When the power goes out, even for a few minutes, we feel lost, uncomfortable, and disconnected. But for medieval people, light was a scarce and precious resource, one that defined the boundaries of life itself. It was a flickering, smoky, costly struggle against an overwhelming darkness that shaped every part of daily life. Light was survival, light was hope. In medieval homes, the fading light wasn't just a signal to rest, it was the cue for carefully observed rituals. Families gathered around their lone flame for prayer, often reciting the Our Father or Hail Mary together before bed. This wasn't merely spiritual, it was a way to find comfort in the face of encroaching darkness and unseen dangers. For many, candlelight was linked closely to faith. Churches were among the few places with steady beeswax candles illuminating altars and stained glass, and their glow symbolized divine presence. People believed that the light of a candle could ward off evil spirits, and candles were often lit in memory of the dead or as offerings during difficult times. At home, the last candle was sometimes carried to each family member as a blessing, a final connection before sleep. These acts were small anchors in a world otherwise ruled by uncertainty. Outside the home, medieval streets rarely glowed with light. Most towns had only dim lanterns near important buildings or city gates, and street lighting was minimal at best. People didn't socialize much after dark. Instead, they sought safety and warmth indoors. The night curfew, or couvre-feu, enforced by local authorities, wasn't just to prevent fires, but to limit who could be out after sunset. Wandering strangers were suspicious, and the dark became a boundary line between the known and unknown. Evenings were quiet, filled mostly with whispered conversations and the occasional knock at a neighbor's door. Festivals and markets were daytime events. At night, life slowed, giving way to silence and waiting. Candles were so valuable that neighbors sometimes shared them, especially during communal events or emergencies. If a family had no candle, a neighbor might lend one for the night, knowing they would need it in return another time. Churches often acted as community lighthouses, where people gathered for vigils, celebrations, or important announcements, illuminated by rows of carefully tended beeswax candles. These moments of collective light were rare and deeply meaningful, a break from the isolating darkness of everyday nights. The weakness and unpredictability of candlelight also influenced how people slept. The long nights often led to segmented sleep, a practice where people slept in 2 shifts, waking for an hour or 2 in the middle of the night before returning to bed. During this quiet waking period, they might pray, talk softly, or simply sit by the dying candle flame. This was not insomnia, but a culturally accepted way of living with darkness, structured around the limited availability of light. Candlelight in the Middle Ages was never just light. It was a constant negotiation between darkness and survival, comfort and danger, community and isolation. Its flickering glow shaped how people lived, how they connected, and how they faced the long, relentless nights. More than warmth or convenience, candlelight was a symbol of endurance in a world governed by shadows.
When the sun slipped away, it wasn't just darkness that filled the air. It was fear. Not the sudden kind, the sharp jolt of danger you might outrun or fight, but a quiet, creeping dread. The kind that settles into your bones, the kind that whispers in the silence. In the Middle Ages, shadows weren't just empty space, they were places where the unknown gathered, where the restless dead stirred, where witches plotted, where demons watched and waited. People lived in a world they understood less than we do. Science was limited, and many natural events felt like signs or punishments from unseen forces. Illness could strike without warning, crops might fail, animals might die suddenly, people were vulnerable, and the night was a time when those vulnerabilities felt magnified. Darkness became a symbol not just of the absence of light, but of the absence of safety. Medieval nights echoed with stories told in hushed tones, stories of ghosts wandering churchyards, of witches who could change shape, of spirits trapped between worlds. Parents warned children to behave, lest the shadows come for them. Travelers prayed for safe passage after dark, clutching charms or holy symbols. These tales weren't just superstition, they were a way to explain a frightening world, to warn and to protect. Without reliable light, the imagination filled in the gaps. A creaking floorboard might be a restless ghost. A flicker in the corner might be a lurking demon. The natural sounds of night became a chorus of hidden threats. This wasn't just fear for fear's sake, it was survival. Caution kept people alive in a world where help could be far away, and dangers often unseen. In the Middle Ages, the line between the natural and supernatural was thin. People believed the world teemed with spirits, some helpful, many dangerous. Witches were feared not just for their magic, but for their power to harm crops, animals, or even people through curses. Ghosts were restless souls trapped between life and death, wandering the earth in search of peace or revenge. Stories told of shadowy figures at crossroads or along lonely paths, omens of death or disaster. These beliefs shaped behavior. People avoided certain places at night, especially graveyards or crossroads, which were thought to be gateways to the spirit world. To keep the darkness at bay, medieval people used every tool available. Holy water was sprinkled around homes. Salt was scattered at thresholds to block evil spirits. Amulets carved with religious symbols were worn or hung near beds. Candles themselves held protective power, especially beeswax tapers blessed by priests. Lighting one was more than illumination. It was a ward against malevolent forces. Prayer was central. Many families had nightly rituals invoking saints or angels to guard the home until dawn. This ever-present fear shaped how people moved through their days and nights. Nighttime journeys were avoided whenever possible. Travelers planned carefully, carrying protective charms and blessings. Within homes, people stayed close to the hearth, keeping the fire alive, not just for warmth, but as a beacon of safety. Loud noises or gatherings were rare after dark. Noise might attract spirits or worse. Fear limited freedoms, but it also created strong bonds, families and communities clinging together, finding strength in shared belief and mutual protection. In a world shadowed by uncertainty, fear wasn't just personal, it was a tool wielded by authorities. Local lords, clergy and town officials often reinforced fears of witches, demons and spirits to maintain order and obedience. Accusations of witchcraft or heresy could arise from simple misfortune, a failed crop, an illness, or even a neighbor's bad luck. These fears justified harsh punishments and social exclusion, but also tightened community bonds by defining clear others to blame. Public trials and punishments
served as grim reminders of the dangers lurking, not just in the shadows, but within the community itself. Though darkness invited fear, it also called for vigilance. Communities organized night watches, groups of men tasked with patrolling streets, watching for thieves, fires, or supernatural threats. Carrying torches or crude lanterns, these watchers moved cautiously through narrow alleys, their presence both a comfort and a warning. Within homes, families remained alert. The fragile candle flame was a signal to stay awake, keep watch, or whisper prayers until dawn's safe light returned.
Living with this pervasive fear shaped medieval people's inner lives. The night was a boundary between the known and unknown, between safety and danger. It influenced dreams, hopes, and anxieties. Some sought solace in religion, others in superstition. The dark hours were often a time of contemplation, but also unease. This psychological burden made light more than a physical necessity. It became a symbol of hope, safety, and the promise of a new day. Despite the weight of fear, medieval people endured. They developed rituals, shared stories, and created communities strong enough to face the night together. The flickering candle flame, the whispered prayer, the watchful neighbor, these small acts pushed back the shadows, carving out moments of peace amid uncertainty. In the Middle Ages, the veil between the living and the dead was believed to be thin, especially after sunset. Shadows weren't just empty spaces, but were thought to be filled with restless spirits, souls trapped between worlds, wandering the earth for reasons only the divine could understand. Ghost stories were not just bedtime tales, they were serious warnings and reflections of cultural beliefs. Many believed that spirits who had died with unfinished business or violent ends could return to haunt the living. Churchyards and crossroads were especially feared places at night, because they were believed to be gateways to the spirit world. Demons, too, were believed to roam the darkness, looking for human souls to tempt or torment. These entities weren't simply figments of imagination, but were real threats in medieval spirituality. The Church preached about the devil's minions actively seeking to corrupt humanity, particularly in the quiet and vulnerable hours of night. One of the more terrifying beliefs involved the incubi and succubi, male and female demons that supposedly visited sleeping people, often attacking them physically and spiritually. These demons were blamed for nightmares, sleep paralysis, and even sudden illnesses. People believed that these demonic visitors could steal a person's vitality, leaving them weak or sick. Some accused those suffering from such attacks of witchcraft or moral failing, further fueling social paranoia and persecution. Witches were believed to be able to take on animal forms, turning into cats, wolves, or birds, to move unseen through the night. This ability made them especially frightening, as they could slip past human defenses and spy on or harm neighbors without being caught. Witchcraft wasn't only about magic spells, but was linked deeply with community fear and suspicion. A sudden illness, a failed harvest, or an unexplained misfortune could all lead to bechurchment. Accusations that a neighbor had made a pact with dark forces, using their shape-shifting powers to curse or harm. The church played a complex role in this shadowy world. It was both a source of comfort and fear. Priests preached sermons warning of the dangers lurking in the nigh, demons waiting to claim souls and witches conspiring against the faithful. At the same time, the church offered protection through rituals, holy relics, and blessings. Masses and prayers were believed to keep evil forces at bay, and candles blessed by priests held power far beyond simple light. As winter's cold deepened and nights grew longer, the shadows didn't just grow. They seemed to stretch into something more alive, more dangerous. Villagers huddled indoors, their fires crackling. But outside, the darkness was thick with stories and fears. It was during these long, bitter winters that whispers of witches gained louder voices. Witches were blamed for crop failures, sickness, and unexplained misfortunes, things that happened far too often in winter's harsh grip. When food was scarce and bodies grew weak, people sought answers, and fear turned neighbor against neighbor. The long nights gave more time for dread to settle in. Without much light or warmth, the cold was not just a physical enemy but a psychological one.
fueling superstitions and deepening the sense that winter was a season ruled by unseen, malevolent forces. So, while frost bit at the skin and hunger gnawed at the belly, it was the fear in the shadows, the dread of witches, spirits and demons that made winter truly miserable. Winter was not just a season of cold and hunger, it was a season when fear grew alongside the frost. The long nights stretched endlessly, giving shadows time to creep, and minds time to wander into dark thoughts. For medieval people, who relied so heavily on daylight and warmth, winter's extended darkness was a breeding ground for dread. When the days shortened and the temperature dropped, the natural world seemed to retreat, leaving humans isolated and vulnerable. Fires burned low, food stores ran thin, and bodies weakened by cold and hunger were prime targets for disease and despair. It was during these bleak months that stories of witches and malevolent spirits grew louder. Villagers whispered about neighbors who might be witches, blaming them for blighted crops, livestock deaths, or sudden illnesses. In a time when survival was already a struggle, such fears could fracture communities. Witches were believed to have the power to command the elements, and winter, especially a harsh winter, was often seen as a sign of their dark influence. When snow fell early or cold storms ravaged the land, suspicions turned toward those accused of witchcraft. In villages throughout Europe, winter was a time when accusations soared. People sought explanations for their suffering, and witches became convenient scapegoats. Trials and punishments were more common in these months, fueled by desperation and fear. The cold night air wasn't just physically biting. It was thought to carry curses and dark magic. Travelers feared walking alone, knowing that witches could be lurking in the forests or watching from the shadows, ready to curse or steal their life force. Beyond the physical hardships, winter brought psychological challenges amplified by fear. With fewer daylight hours, people spent more time indoors, often isolated from wider community life. The hearth fire was a comfort but also a reminder of vulnerability. The flame could flicker and die, plunging a household into darkness. In this silence, minds could wander to the unseen dangers whispered about in church sermons and folk tales. Nightmares and sleep disturbances became common, worsened by beliefs in incubi and succubi, dark spirits said to attack sleepers, especially during the vulnerable hours before dawn. This mental burden made winter a time not just of survival, but endurance. Hope was fragile, and the promise of spring was distant. In these long, oppressive months, religion became a vital source of strength. Churches held special masses and prayers, asking for protection against evil forces, and families kept holy relics and blessed objects close. Candles blessed by priests were lit not only to illuminate, but to push back the darkness, both physical and spiritual. Rituals before sleep, like prayers or the sign of the cross, became shields against nightmares and evil visits. The church's message was clear. While the darkness was real and dangerous, faith could protect the soul. Winter was a time of waiting for the thaw, for the sun's return, for relief. But it was also a season of worry, where fear lived as palpably as frostbite. The physical misery of hunger, cold, and illness is intertwined with anxiety about unseen dangers. In this way, winter in the Middle Ages was not just harsh because of the weather. It was harsh because darkness amplified every fear, every uncertainty, every whispered suspicion. When winter cast its long shadow over medieval Europe, days grew short and nights stretched endlessly. For those living through this harsh season, sleep was not the simple, continuous rest we expect today. Instead, the rhythm of sleep was broken into distinct phases, a first sleep followed by a waking period, then a second sleep before dawn. This segmented sleep pattern was a natural response to the challenges of winter, the cold, the darkness, and the ever-present fears that crept along with them. This nightly waking period, often lasting an hour or two, was far from idle. It was a time when everyday life shifted gears, when quiet actions, small rituals, and communal habits kept people connected, vigilant, and sane amid the oppressive winter gloom. As dusk fell and the evening meal ended, families gathered around the hearth, their primary source of warmth and light during the coldest months. The flicker of flames cast long, trembling shadows that danced against stone walls and timber beams, creating an atmosphere both comforting and haunting. After prayers and simple household chores, people would prepare for bed, often sharing the same sleeping space with family members or even animals for added warmth. Beds were heavy with thick blankets or straw-filled mattresses designed to trap what little heat the room held. The first sleep came swiftly, pulled on by exhaustion from laboring in frigid fields or cold workshops. For several hours the body sank into rest, muscles relaxing, minds escaping into dreams, though even these were often tinged with the season's anxieties. Around midnight, many would awaken naturally from their first sleep, a phenomenon documented across medieval texts and later confirmed by historians studying pre-industrial sleep patterns. This waking period, often called the watch or dead time, was a liminal hour, neither day nor fully night, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was believed to thin. It was a time charged with potential both hopeful and frightening. Some remained in bed quietly reciting prayers, asking for protection from evil spirits and ill fortune. The church encouraged this practice, offering specific nighttime prayers designed to shield the faithful from demons and witches, said to roam at these vulnerable hours. Not everyone stayed tucked under their blankets during this time. Many rose to tend to practical needs or keep watch against dangers both natural and supernatural. The hearth fire required tending. A dying flame could plunge a room into complete darkness and dangerous cold. Someone might rekindle embers or add more wood, careful not to disturb the household's fragile warmth.
Others used the time to visit the chamber pot or step outside briefly to relieve themselves, navigating dark hallways or snowy courtyards by the dim glow of a candle or lantern.
Many medieval people believed that waking in the dark was perilous. Visions, nightmares, and feelings of oppression were common. Sleep paralysis, then unknown medically, was often interpreted as a demon sitting on the chest, stealing breath and causing terror. In this fragile state between sleep and wakefulness, the mind was vulnerable to fears, both real and imagined. Stories passed down through generations reinforced the idea that the night was a time when evil sought entrance to human homes and souls. After this vigil, people would return to their beds for the second sleep, a last period of rest before the pale light of dawn. This sleep was lighter, often interrupted by the cold or early chores, but carried with it a quiet hope that morning would bring warmth, safety, and another day to endure the winter's harshness. This segmented pattern of sleep, shaped by the demands of medieval life, reveals much about how people endured the misery of winter. They adapted, not just physically, with layers of clothing, shared beds, and careful food storage, but mentally and spiritually. Midnight wakefulness was a time of practical care, spiritual defense, and social connection, helping medieval people face the long night's darkness and fear. Understanding this rhythm invites us to imagine winter nights, not simply as a time of suffering, but as a complex dance of endurance, vigilance, and hope. As the hearth's glow faded and the first sleep slipped away, medieval people found themselves awake in a world governed by darkness, a darkness that was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Long before the invention of electric lights, nighttime was a realm of uncertainty, suspicion, and sometimes stark survival. We are fortunate that a few medieval writers left behind reflections hinting at this segmented sleep. One such chronicler, the English monk Walter Hilton, wrote in the late 14th century about the restlessness that night brought. He described how waking in the dead hours was a chance to reflect, pray, and confront the fears that daylight might hide. When the night grows deep and the world is hushed, the soul's fears rise like the cold wind outside the cell's window. It is a time of trial, where shadows speak and the heart wrestles with unseen terrors. For ordinary folk, such moments could be even more acute. The absence of light in winter meant that those dark hours were not just quiet, but alive with the possibility of misfortune. In a typical peasant home, the long winter nights forced adaptations. Shared beds were common to conserve heat. Families and sometimes even animals like pigs or cats squeezed together for warmth. But even the closest bodies could not fully keep out the creeping cold or the anxiety that came with darkness. One chronicler, Jean de Joinville, a French nobleman writing about his life in the 13th century, noted that villagers often rose during the night to check the hearth fire. The fire is the last defense against the cold and the dark. When it falters, the house feels as if it might be swallowed by the night itself. Without steady light, household tasks were limited but not absent. Women might quietly sew by candlelight or prepare herbal remedies, while men might keep a watchful eye on the door, knowing that bandits and wolves were more brazen under the cover of night. Beyond practical concerns, the waking hours were filled with spiritual and psychological vigilance.
Long winter nights fed superstitions and fears about witches, demons, and restless spirits, dark forces believed to be most active during the dead of night. Medieval texts often warn that witches used the darkness to harm crops or families, making the cold, hungry winter feel like a season of spiritual assault as well as physical hardship. Religious rituals were a lifeline. Families recited prayers specifically for protection during midnight hours, and many kept relics or holy water nearby as safeguards. The Church's message was clear: darkness was dangerous, but faith could push it back. Monks and nuns who lived under strict routines used the midnight hours for prayer and meditation, seeking strength to face both the literal cold and the metaphorical darkness. Even in the biting cold and enveloping dark, people were not wholly alone. Village life adjusted to winter's demands. Some nights neighbors gathered quietly for shared prayers or stories, their voices low to keep from disturbing others. This communal aspect of midnight wakefulness helped stave off the crushing loneliness and fear that winter's long nights could bring. After the watchful vigil, people returned to bed for their second sleep, clinging to the hope that dawn's light would bring warmth and safety. Yet, with winter's chill still biting and the days painfully short, dawn was often a dim, fragile thing. In this way, winter's misery was as much about the tyranny of darkness, literal and psychological, as it was about cold and hunger. Imagine a medieval village at the heart of winter. The sun has long disappeared below the horizon, leaving only a faint glow of twilight at best. The chill seeps through cracks in walls made of wattle and daub or rough stone. The hearth's embers have begun to die down, and the flicker of a candle casts uneasy shadows on the cold floor.
Families huddle under heavy blankets stuffed with straw or wool, seeking warmth. Yet, as the clock nears midnight, more accurately, the period just past dusk, many will awaken from their first sleep groggy and disoriented, to find themselves plunged into darkness. The absence of light was not only a physical barrier, but a psychological one. Without the glow of a fire or candle, the house becomes a cavern of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of timber or the distant howl of wolves. At this time, the cold often deepened. Stone and wood, already chilled by the winter air, seemed to suck warmth from the bones. Some medieval households might maintain the fire burning low through the night, but wood was precious, and the smoke was stifling in poorly ventilated homes. Waking in the dark hours, without modern comforts, gave rise to a mix of emotions. Relief for a moment's wakefulness might be accompanied by dread of the unknown lurking beyond the walls. Medieval scholars and writers frequently noted the special character of this time. The English monk Walter Hilton described it as a time of trial, when fears rose unbidden and spirits were especially vulnerable. For peasants whose lives depended heavily on the cycle of day and night, winter's darkness brought a kind of mental weariness. The mind, starved of stimulation, often wandered into memories, worries, or religious meditation. At the same time, it could be a period of unexpected clarity or creativity. Some took advantage of the quiet to pray, to reflect, or to quietly work. An anonymous 14th century peasant's diary from northern England reveals glimpses into this midnight wakefulness. After the first sleep, I awoke to the silence of the night, save the wind that rattled the shutters. The hearth had almost died, and I moved carefully to add more wood, mindful of waking my children. The chill pressed in, and I sat a while, whispering the prayers my mother taught me, asking Saint Michael for protection. Outside, I heard the distant baying of dogs, wolves perhaps, or men keeping watch. I feared the night, yet knew I must endure it, as I had many times before. This passage paints a vivid image of the constant interplay between physical survival and spiritual defense during winter nights. The time between first and second sleep was not wholly idle. Despite the cold, the dark, and the temptation to simply lie awake, people engaged in small but essential activities. Women might quietly sew or darn clothes, working by the flicker of candlelight to mend garments frayed by daily labor. This was vital in a season when buying new clothing was a luxury few could afford. Men sometimes sharpened tools or prepared weapons, conscious that winter brought both natural dangers and human threats. In some households,
The night watch or the eldest family member would keep vigil by the door, alert for signs of intruders or wild animals. Light was precious. Candles were expensive and made from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax, the latter much rarer and more costly. A single candle might burn for only a few hours, so it was rationed carefully. Lanterns, made from wood and horn, offered dimmer light but could be carried outside. When the fire was low and candles nearly burned out, darkness would envelop the home completely. This fragility of light meant that people developed habits around conserving it. Tasks were prioritized and social activity slowed. Too much movement risked extinguishing flames. Fear of the dark supernatural dangers was not mere superstition, but deeply woven into the medieval worldview. Witches were believed to use the night's cover to curse crops, harm livestock, or even steal children. Demons prowled the shadowy corners, waiting for moments of weakness. Families placed charms around their homes, crosses carved into doors, blessed salt sprinkled on thresholds, or holy water sprinkled around beds. Prayers like the Pater Noster, Our Father, and Ave Maria, Hail Mary, were whispered repeatedly. Some households kept small prayer books handy for these dark hours. Many medieval people experienced what we now call sleep paralysis, a terrifying phenomenon where one awakens unable to move, often sensing a malevolent presence. These episodes were interpreted as the old hag sitting on the sleeper's chest, a demon-like figure believed to suffocate victims. Such experiences fed into the general anxiety of the long winter night, further making sleep a battleground against fear. Despite the chill and darkness, communities did not entirely retreat into solitude. Some villages had regular midnight vigils, religious or social gatherings held during the long winter nights, where people would pray together, share stories, or sing hymns. These gatherings reinforced social cohesion and provided warmth and light that individual households could not sustain alone. Village watchmen or guards played a crucial role in this period. Patrolling through snow-covered streets, often armed with torches and weapons, they protected against fires, theft, and wild animals emboldened by hunger. Their presence was a tangible reminder of the dangers lurking in darkness and winter's role in magnifying those dangers. The segmented sleep pattern combined with the long dark nights created a cycle that was taxing on medieval minds. Lack of sunlight disrupted natural circadian rhythms. Seasonal affective disorder, though not named then, likely afflicted many. Depression, anxiety, and loneliness were common companions of the winter months, making the physical cold even harder to bear. After the waking period, people returned to bed for the second sleep, often lighter and interrupted. This sleep carried a fragile hope, the hope that they would survive the night, that winter would not claim them before spring. Yet dawn was often grey and cold, and the misery of winter's darkness stretched still ahead. The harsh truth about medieval winters wasn't just the crushing weight of night's darkness, it was how that darkness crept relentlessly into the fragile daylight hours, squeezing them down to a bitter handful of weak sunbeams. In northern Europe, winter days could last as little as 6 or 7 hours, and often the sun barely crested the horizon before dipping away again. Even when it did rise, a thick shroud of clouds, fog, or biting frost muted the light to a dull grey. Without modern lamps or electricity, daylight was more than just time to work. It was the lifeblood of daily existence. Families waited for that faint glow to filter through small, grimy windows made from animal horn or thin panes of mica, trying to squeeze as much usefulness as possible from the limited hours before darkness reclaimed the sky. Winter mornings began slowly. The cold made waking difficult, and stone walls and thatched roofs offered little protection from icy drafts. Outside, the fields lay frozen and barren, a bleak canvas of white under a pale, diffused sun. For peasants and farmers, the winter pause was agonizing. The earth was locked tight beneath a crust of frost, forbidding tilling or planting. Seeds rested in cold storehouses, waiting for spring's return. Yet animals still demanded care and attention, regardless of the weather's cruelty. Tending livestock became a brutal daily grind. Cows, sheep, and pigs crowded into stables and pens, sharing body heat to survive. Feeding them meant hauling heavy bundles of hay or root vegetables through snow-covered paths, hands numbed by cold, breath billowing in frosty clouds. Frozen water troughs had to be broken open, or replenished with precious melted snow. Gathering fuel was an unending challenge. Wood was the kingdom's currency in winter, and forests, though nearby, were dangerous to access in icy conditions. Villagers spent long, arduous hours chopping and hauling firewood, knowing that without it, hearths would die and homes would become freezing tombs. Some communities relied on peat, dug from bogs, but this too was a demanding, back-breaking labor that required skill and stamina. Inside homes, women turned to tasks that could be done by the faint daylight or the flickering firelight. Spinning wool into thread, weaving, mending worn clothes, these simple acts were lifelines to warmth and survival. The cold made fingers stiff and slow, yet the work never ceased.
Food scarcity pressed on every household like a heavy shroud.
Winter months were a time of rationing and sacrifice. Stored provisions, coarse rye bread, salted pork, dried fish, and root vegetables formed the bulk of the diet, nourishing but often barely enough. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a distant memory, and nutritional deficiencies left many weak and vulnerable to illness. Hunting and foraging in winter were perilous but sometimes necessary. Brave souls ventured into the frozen forests in search of nuts, mushrooms, or game, taking risks against the merciless cold and lurking predators. The psychological weight of the short grey days was profound. Without the sun's warmth or light, spirits waned. What modern science now calls seasonal affective disorder likely afflicted many medieval souls, though they understood it through religious or superstitious lenses. The Church urged prayer and fasting as cures for bodily and spiritual malaise, while community festivals provided rare flickers of light and hope. Travel between villages slowed or halted, markets became scarce, and fairs vanished under the snow's blanket. Social life contracted to the hearth's immediate glow, where families and neighbors huddled together to share stories, prayers, and whatever comfort they could muster. Yet even in this bleak season, life persisted. The rhythm of prayer, labor, rest, and social connection held firm. The struggle to gather fuel, feed animals, and mend clothes went on day after short day, each one a small battle against winter's unforgiving grip. Clothing became a vital armor against the cold, layers of woolen tunics, cloaks, and hoods, wrapped tightly, but rarely enough to keep the chill entirely at bay. Homes, drafty and dark, offered only limited refuge, their stone or timber walls cold to the touch. At the heart of every household, the hearth was king. The fire's warm glow was a beacon of life, and keeping it alive was a relentless task. Fuel was precious, wood was damp or scarce, and the smoke stifled in rooms with little ventilation. But the fire meant warmth, light, and the ability to cook food. Without it, survival was impossible. Children and the elderly bore the harshest burdens. Fragile bodies shivered in insufficient warmth, and high infant mortality rates during winter were tragically common. Elderly villagers struggled under the weight of cold and exhaustion, their frailty magnified by scarcity and hardship. Still, through hunger, fatigue, and endless grey, people persevered. The long winter days, though diminished and dulled, were vital. They were the battlegrounds where medieval people fought to keep darkness at bay and survive another season ruled by cold and shadow.
In the long frozen winters of the Middle Ages, night was not merely an absence of light. It was a heavy, living presence that stretched endlessly, wrapping the world in shadows and silence. And yet, as long as the night endured, so too did the fragile hope for dawn. An event awaited with quiet reverence, as if the slow creeping of light across the cold, dark landscape was a sacred ritual itself. The night did not simply end with a sudden burst of brightness. Instead, it faded slowly, in stages, as if reluctant to let go of its grip. In the earliest hours before dawn, often the coldest and most still, the world remained suspended in an uneasy quiet. Homes huddled beneath thick roofs, their occupants wrapped in woolen blankets, waiting, hearts heavy with both fatigue and anticipation. Those wakeful hours between midnight and dawn were filled with muted sounds, the crackle of dying embers in the hearth, the faint rustle of restless children, the muffled footsteps of a mother checking on her family. Outside, the wind whispered across frozen fields, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. It was a liminal time, neither night nor day,
a fragile pause between darkness and light. For medieval people, this slow end to night was deeply woven into their experience of winter. Darkness governed their movements, their fears and their routines. But the return of dawn offered more than just light. It brought relief, renewal, and a fragile promise of survival. As the horizon began to glow faintly, a pale wash of pink or grey would seep into the sky. This dawn was gentle, almost hesitant, like the first breath after a long, suffocating night. It was a quiet moment that marked a profound shift. Families stirred, doors and shutters creaked open. The cold morning air filled rooms with sharp clarity. With the dawn came the possibility of movement, of leaving the confines of dark, cramped homes to face the challenges of the day. The return of light transformed the frozen landscape. Icy branches sparkled, snow gleamed faintly, and distant hills emerged from shadow. Though the sun remained weak and low, even this modest glow carried a powerful psychological weight, lifting the heaviness that winter night had imposed. Medieval life was deeply intertwined with religious rhythms, and dawn held spiritual significance. Morning prayers, the matins or lauds, were said as light returned, a daily ritual offering thanks and asking for protection through the coming day. For many, dawn was a signal to prepare for labor, whether tending animals, repairing tools, or setting out to gather wood and food. The slow fading of night gave way to the urgency of daylight, pressing people to move swiftly while the sun lasted. Yet the daylight hours that followed dawn were fleeting. Winter's short days meant that the light would soon dwindle again, and with it the freedom to work and move. This cycle of darkness giving way to brief light, only to return again, framed medieval existence in winter. The slow end of night was a small but crucial victory, a moment of grace before the struggle began anew. The long winter nights had left people weary, their bodies stiff and spirits dulled. But waiting for dawn was also a quiet act of hope and endurance. There was comfort in the certainty of dawn's return, even if the coming day promised more hardship. In some ways, the slow ending of night was a daily lesson in patience, an acceptance of life's rhythms shaped by forces beyond human control. The slow return of light was a reminder that medieval people's lives were governed as much by the cycles of nature as by human will. Winter darkness was oppressive, but the dawn brought clarity, work, and connection. In this way, the night ended slowly, but so too did the story of survival in a world where light was power and darkness ruled. For the peasant, dawn was not greeted with poetry. It was not a slow, beautiful promise rising over the horizon. It was a deadline, a cold, grey demand. There was no quiet reflection as the first light crept through the gaps in the shutters, only a race against the coming hours to survive another day. By the time light began to return, many peasants were already half awake, shivering, coughing and sore from the thin bedding and the cold that had seeped into their bones during the long, punishing night. There were no real mattresses, no pillows. Beds, if they had them, were wooden frames with straw stuffed into sacks, sometimes crawling with lice or damp from the freezing air. Blankets were often made from old patched wool, rarely thick enough to fight the winter chill. Families huddled together for warmth, parents with children, brothers with sisters, sometimes even lying beside livestock brought into the home overnight just to make the room bearable. When the faintest light arrived, the room didn't brighten, it merely turned from black to dark grey. There were no curtains to draw back dramatically, no letting the sunshine in. The windows, if they existed, were little more than holes covered with fabric or translucent horn, smeared with grease to keep the wind out. The only thing that changed was that people could now begin to move without bumping into each other. For peasants, waking at dawn wasn't a new beginning, it was a continuation of the struggle that had never really stopped. The first sleep, the midnight wakefulness, the second sleep, they all merged into a long, broken night. Sleep was functional, the rest was incomplete. And yet, as the cold seeped deeper into their homes, they had no choice but to rise.
Mothers dressed their children in stiff, reused layers, clothes worn for days or weeks on end. Water was often frozen, and heating it took precious firewood. So they splashed their faces with frigid water or skipped washing altogether. A hot breakfast was rare. More often, they chewed on a crust of yesterday's bread or drank thin, sour ale, something, anything, to warm the belly. Men and boys were sent outside to feed the animals, chop wood, or begin whatever outdoor tasks could be done in the narrow window of light. But the ground was frozen, their fingers numb, their breath a fog that disappeared into the early mist. Inside, women rekindled the hearth, if they could. The fire often burned down to embers overnight, and if it had gone out entirely, the house would be bitterly cold. Relighting it meant flint, steel, kindling, and prayer. Some villages shared fire from neighbour to neighbour, borrowing a glowing ember if their own hearth had failed. Once warmth returned, chores resumed. Spinning wool, boiling broth, patching torn garments, scraping soot from the walls, preparing dried beans for the midday meal, every task had to be completed by mid-afternoon. Because when the light vanished again, it took time with it. Daylight didn't liberate peasants, it bound them. It was a ticking clock. It demanded speed, efficiency, and obedience. Because when it left, they would once again be trapped in darkness, cold, and silence. And yet, how often did the peasant mother pause to watch the dawn? How often did the young ploughboy look to the horizon and whisper thanks for the sun? Not often. Because light didn't mean comfort. It meant labour. And even in its return, the light was thin, pale, barely strong enough to cut through the fog. It offered no warmth. It gave no mercy. It simply meant the beginning of another round of survival. Among wealthier classes, dawn might carry spiritual significance, a time to read scripture, to write letters by firelight, or to meditate before attending early mass. But the poor had no books, no private chapels, no candlelit mornings of reflection. Their prayers were whispered while kneeling on freezing floors. Their meditation came in the form of silence, broken only by the scraping of iron pots and the cries of hungry children. Their dawn came with frostbitten toes and calloused hands, already aching from the day before. Dawn was supposed to be a symbol of hope, and maybe on some days it was. But hope wears thin when it's tested every morning by the same hunger, the same cold, the same darkness that never really lifts. Sometimes, as the night ended and the grey light returned, it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like resignation. And yet, despite everything, they rose. They stepped into the cold. They fed the livestock. They gathered wood. They worked, they prayed, they suffered, and they survived. The night ended slowly. But so did the fight. They endured, not because winter was merciful, but because they had no choice. And as the first weak light touched the walls of their homes, they knew that darkness would return again soon. But for now, there was work to be done. In the medieval winter, darkness wasn't just a backdrop. It was a force, a ruler. And like all rulers, it treated people differently, depending on their place in the world. For the poor, night was a kind of prison. For the rich, it was merely a mild inconvenience. And the dividing line between these two experiences? Light. Light was more than just visibility, it was freedom, it was safety, it was control over your own time, and it was expensive. For most peasants and labourers, the end of daylight meant the end of the day. With no lamps, no candles, no oil, and only a few dying embers in the hearth, the world shrank down to a small radius of grey flicker and deep shadow. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, rooms fell silent. Movement slowed, tasks ceased. There was no reading, no writing, no leisure, and no light to speak of. The hearth might stay alive for a while, its flame casting long, uneven shadows on the timber walls, but it wasn't bright enough to do anything meaningful by. A single candle could cost as much as a day's wages. For a peasant family, that was unthinkable. So, night didn't belong to them. They surrendered to it. In wealthy homes, things looked entirely different. Manor houses and monasteries had stores of tallow and beeswax candles, oil lamps, and sometimes even servants assigned to maintain them. A candle, especially one made of beeswax, burned clean and bright, casting warm light across tapestries and stone walls.
For the wealthy, it meant evenings filled with reading, conversation, or prayer. Some hosted meals and music into the night, bathed in candlelight. Others retreated into private studies or chapels, where a lamp flickered beside open books or scrolls. To a peasant looking up at the manor on a dark winter night, that glowing window in the upper story may as well have been a star. It wasn't just illumination, it was power made visible. Beeswax was precious. It burned longer, cleaner, and smelled sweet. Only churches, monasteries, and noble houses could afford it in any quantity.
Tallow, made from rendered animal fat, was the alternative for the slightly better off poor. It was cheaper, but it smoked heavily and filled rooms with a greasy, rancid odor. Lighting one was a commitment to both illumination and suffering. But even tallow wasn't common in most peasant homes. The fat was too valuable as food. What little lighting they had came from the fire itself or from torches made of bundled reeds dipped in animal grease, if they were lucky. Access to light meant access to time. In the dark, most people were forced to rise and rest with the sun, but with a lamp or candle, one could extend their day. That extra hour or two after sundown became a luxury of its own. For the poor, winter compressed their world. Their day might end by 4 or 5 p.m., and after that, there was nothing to do but eat if there was food, tend the fire, pray, and go to bed. Night wasn't a space for reflection, it was a waiting room for the next day's work. The wealthy could stretch their evenings as they pleased. They might write letters, conduct business, or teach their children to read. Light gave them the gift of time, and time was a resource more valuable than gold. In the poorest villages, darkness was feared, not just for what it hid, but for what it invited. Wolves, bandits, ghosts, real and imagined, took on sharper teeth in the absence of light. Doors were barred early, paths were abandoned. Entire communities retreated into silence until the morning. For the elite, night brought no such terror. Guards patrolled the estate. Fires and lamps burned through the hours. Candles lined the chapel walls where monks whispered prayers long after the stars rose. They lived on the same night, but not in the same world. Perhaps nowhere was the light divide more painfully clear than in the world of learning. Monasteries were islands of light in a sea of darkness. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. They studied, debated, and composed hymns during long winter nights. Cathedrals, too, were spaces of sacred illumination, where flickering flames echoed divine light. Meanwhile, peasant children, if they could read at all, had no chance to study at night. There were no books in the house and no light to read them by, even if there had been. Learning belonged to those who could afford to see after sunset. It's easy to forget that staying awake at night was a kind of power. To choose how long your day lasted was not a decision most medieval people could make. For the peasant, the dark forced obedience. Work ceased, eyes closed, bodies lay still under scratchy blankets, awaiting the light's permission to move again. For the wealthy, the day was theirs to command. They could host a feast well after nightfall, or hold private councils lit by a dozen candles. They could stay awake, thinking, writing, planning, while the world outside slept in the cold. In this way, winter nights were not just miserable because they were long and cold. They were miserable because they reminded the poor of what they lacked. Light was a mirror, showing them what they were not allowed to have. Every flickering candle in a noble's window was a sign someone else's night was warmer, brighter, and freer than yours. The gulf between those who had light and those who didn't played out everywhere, in homes, workshops, fields, churches, and even in sleep. For peasants, night was more than a challenge, it was an unyielding boundary delineating the limits of their world. Picture a humble peasant kitchen. Its walls blackened by smoke, its single hearth barely glowing, warmed by embers. Meal preparation was hurried, huddled around the fire's flicker. Tasks that required more light, like cutting meat, preparing herbs, or even kneading dough, were rushed or postponed, waiting for midday brightness. There was no sense of calm or leisure in that low, smoky glow, only necessity. Contrast this with a noble household's great hall. Here, tallow and beeswax candles cast a warm, even light across long tables and carved wooden beams. Servants bustled, lamps were maintained, and scholars or scribes might work at a desk in the quiet corner. In winter, these grand estates remained surprisingly lively after nightfall. People could eat, read, pray, and converse long after darkness had swallowed the peasant world. In many regions, rulers imposed candle taxes,
a levy on the production or sale of candles. This increased the cost of light, making it even less accessible to the lower classes. Every candle that burned in a peasant's home, if they were lucky, was paid for in hardship. That single flame might symbolize long hours of labor, or the choice between warmth and letting a child sleep by its glow. For those who worked in monasteries or cathedrals, however, candlelight was free and abundant. Monastic candle stores, stocked in cellars, served liturgies, rites, and private devotions nightly. In that sacred atmosphere, light was both spiritual sustenance and practical aid. Among the modest peasant class, evening markets or nighttime sales were rare. Without light, there was no space for commerce, for community exchange, for craft making after sundown. But in towns where artisans could afford small workshops lit by tallow lamps, work could continue into the night. A smith might finish a last horseshoe by lamplight. A scribe might work on a commission for a local lord. These craftsmen existed in a twilight zone, enough light to work, not so much as to rival the manor's glow, but enough to extend productivity beyond the day.
Light carried spiritual weight. In churches, rows of beeswax candles lit the altars during long winter services, answering the religious need for symbolic illumination. People came to pray by this glow, offering coins, often their last spare, to see a flame burning in memory of loved ones. For the poor, however, individual spiritual light was rare. A humble chalk cross over a doorway, or a simple oil lamp in the window, was often the extent of their spiritual illumination on cold nights. They relied on collective religious spaces for any hope of warmth beyond the physical. Imagine two homes side by side on a winter's night, one a manor house with lights spilling like a lantern into the courtyard, the other a peasant's hovel, its doorway darkened and cold. Passers-by might hear distant laughter from the manor hall, a sign of festivity or warmth, and contrast it with muffled coughs and shivering bodies within the thatch-roofed cottage. Both families lived the same winter, but in different worlds. One ruled the night, the other succumbed to it. Even within households, access to light wasn't equal. In peasant families, the head of the household, most often a man or an elder, might receive the single candle reserved for evening prayer or reading. Women and children huddled in colder corners went largely dark even after dusk. Among the wealthy, the master or lady of the house might retire to a candlelit chamber with servants to maintain the fire and lamps, an ongoing display of privilege. Staff could remain awake longer to serve them, but only at the cost of burdened labor in the shadows. Access to light in medieval winter was more than comfort, it was power. It determined who could extend their day, who could work, who could learn, who could pray, who could relax, and who couldn't. For the peasants, winter nights and dark days were rulers. They dictated labor, rest, social boundaries, and spiritual life. Without light, their world contracted, hope diminished, and hardship became normalized. And when the candle taxes crept in, when bleak skies swallowed the daylight, and when frost clung to every surface, light became the ultimate privilege, showing who the world favored and who it forgot. Some nights, a peasant would sit by the dying fire and stare into the coals as though trying to see something beyond them, some warmth, some promise. The room behind them would stretch into blackness, filled only with the soft rustle of sleeping children and the creak of the rafters above. There were no candles, no lamps, no moonlight bright enough to spill through the smeared frost-covered window, just the slow orange breath of the hearth as it faded. For those who lived every winter at the mercy of the elements, light became more than a tool. It was something they missed, like a loved one. Something they mourned, as it left each afternoon, and longed for in the hours before dawn. They didn't always speak of it. What could they say? Darkness was a fact of life, not something to complain about. But they felt it, in their bones and in their minds. The gloom made everything heavier. Chores became trials. Time lost its shape. Days collapsed into each other in a grey, grinding rhythm. They'd wake in the black of morning and fumble for their shoes, still damp from the day before, tugging them on with numb fingers. The fire needed coaxing back to life. The baby was crying. The wind howled at the eaves like some old angry ghost, and still there was no light, only smoke and breath like mist, and the vague blue suggestion of morning that would not come for hours.
Some said the darkness changed the way time moved. The days felt shorter, of course, but the nights were eternal. There were moments when a man could swear he'd been sitting by the same hearth, in the same dark silence, for 100 years, just waiting. The children hated it most in the early evenings. After supper, if there was supper, they would grow restless. No books, no games that didn't require sight. Their whispers turned into whines. They'd ask why they couldn't stay up like the Lord's children. "Because we've got no candles," the mother would sigh. "Because our eyes will go blind in this dark. Because tomorrow's work comes early." She might not say what she was really thinking. That the dark wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. It reminded them of what they didn't have. That somewhere up the hill, the manor glowed with golden light, like some kind of earthbound star. And in it were people who laughed and sang and poured warm wine into silver goblets without once glancing at the cost of the candles.
But down here, you counted each one like gold. You used slivers of them, cut them in half and rationed them for feast days or childbirth. You saved wax drippings. You whispered prayers that the next batch of tallow wouldn't stink too badly, that it would at least burn evenly so you could sew a bit longer, or read the holy words scratched onto the only parchment in the house if anyone could read. And still, for all the bitterness, there was a strange reverence for light. When the sun returned, if the clouds allowed it, a person might pause at the doorway and let it fall across their face like a blessing. They'd lift a child up and say, "Look, there it is, there's the day again." And for a few fleeting hours the world would return. You could see the grain in the wood, the stitching in your tunic, the colour of your wife's hair. But the knowledge always lingered. It wouldn't last. The afternoon would bleed away before the second meal, and the shadows would return, first in corners, then across the floor, then swallowing the room whole. Sometimes, in those early dark hours, the old people would speak, softly, just to pass the time. Tales about demons in the woods, or the lights they'd once seen on the hill at night. Strange flickers that weren't from torches or stars. They told stories about witches who walked at dusk, and saints who carried lanterns made of stars, and monks who kept fires that never went out. The children listened wide-eyed, not just from fear, but because stories were the only things that could live in the dark. Nothing else dared to. And so, night after night, winter after winter, peasants lived in a world where light was a kind of grace. It wasn't theirs by right, it was borrowed. Stolen when they could, prayed for when they couldn't. Sometimes, a kind priest might give them a taper from the church candles, a gift, a sign of mercy, and they'd hold it like a relic, storing it in a dry box wrapped in cloth, saving it for some emergency they hoped would never come. Others found light in shared laughter, in voices around the hearth, in singing old songs in the dark, just to remember they still had breath in their lungs. But none of it lit the room, none of it drove back the cold, none of it made winter any shorter. Light was power, and they had so little of it. And so, when they looked up the hill at that glowing manor window, they weren't just seeing a house, they were seeing a different kind of life, one where darkness could be kept at bay, where time didn't stop when the sun went down, where warmth and sight and safety lingered long into the night. And all they could do was turn back to their hearth, blow gently on the embers, and wait. Because for them, night still ruled, and it would until light returned. The dark wasn't just a physical absence, it had a shape, weight, personality. It crawled into the corners of a peasant's home and seemed to whisper. It was a presence they could not see, but one they lived with, intimately. Some even spoke of it like it was a thing that watched. Not a shadow, but a being, a habit, and in winter it was their closest companion. Once the daylight died, the walls closed in, the hearth flickered low, the sound of wind howling through the thatch became constant, and for many hours passed without speaking. There was nothing left to say. You couldn't see the person beside you unless you were both huddled around the fire, sharing its glow. The edges of the room fell into total blackness, and so did the thoughts. Some nights people remembered things that didn't exist, shapes in the dark, breaths that weren't theirs. They didn't call it a hallucination. They called it what they knew: spirits, demons, lost souls of the forest. In many regions, peasants believed that winter nights were longer not just in time, but in suffering.
longer because they were filled with company that didn't belong. One man, an old shepherd, said he once heard whispering in the rafters of his own cottage. Not voices he recognized, but speech that seemed real enough. He blamed it on solitude and long winters, but he never sat alone by the fire again. His neighbors didn't laugh. They nodded. Everyone had some story like that. When the light went out, so did reason. Light grounded you. It gave structure to the day, to the room, to your mind. Without it, things shifted. A bowl in the corner might look like a crouched figure. The door might seem slightly ajar. You couldn't tell how long you'd been sitting. Your memory of what came before the dark began to unravel. What time was it? Had you slept? Was this the first or second sleep? The dark swallowed time, and peasants, who already had so little of it, watched it vanish. And yet, they continued. They adapted. Some families made clever devices, slivers of pine dipped in pitch and tied together like makeshift torches. Others rigged tiny lamps with animal fat using string or linen as a wick. It smoked. It stank. But it gave light. A few managed to save up for a real candle at Christmastide, lighting it with ceremony as if it were sacred. For a few hours, they'd sit up and marvel at the way it lit the wrinkles in their hands, the steam from their porridge, the way it made their children's eyes glow. Then they'd blow it out, and it would all disappear again.
There were community customs around light, too. Some villages had a shared fire, a sacred flame kept burning in a central hearth or by a local wise woman. When a family's fire died in the night, they would take a child with them in the morning, walk barefoot through the frost, and bring back a coal or two wrapped in cloth, a precious ember to relight the hearth. That ember was life. Without it they could freeze, they might starve, or worse, be shamed for letting the dark win. And yet, even those with the strongest fire couldn't ward off the inequality light revealed. Peasants would speak softly after dark about the things they'd seen at the manor, wax tapers in every room, lanterns swinging from iron hooks in the stables, candles stacked like loaves of bread. One boy told of visiting the steward's house and seeing a whole wall bathed in light, just so the master could read a letter. To the poor it felt like magic, not the flickering flame itself, but the freedom it gave. A noble could walk through their house at midnight without tripping over a dog, without stepping on a child, without stumbling into a wall. They could think at night. They could breathe, they could see. The peasant, meanwhile, had to know their own house by feel. Every step was memorized, every sound familiar. They moved like mice, cautiously and close to the floor, hoping not to disturb the others. This created an emotional darkness as well. You weren't just poorer, you were less real. Light gave form, gave recognition. In the dark, you were nobody, a blur, a shadow among other shadows. And so, the misery of winter was not only about cold or hunger or aching joints, it was about invisibility, about being erased, night after night, while others lived on in golden chambers, the flame dancing in their eyes. In some stories told by village elders, light was a sign of divine favor. Those who have candles, they'd mutter, have heaven's ear. Whether or not they believed it didn't matter. It explained the world. It softened the blow. It helped them make sense of why suffering flowed downhill and warmth never stayed long in poor houses. Somewhere in the back of a peasant's mind was always the question, if I had just a little more light, would things be different? Would the child not have coughed so hard last night? Would the stew not have spoiled if I could have seen the rot in the meat? Would the old man have made it to the outhouse without falling? Would I feel so alone? But they didn't speak these questions aloud, because what good would it do? The night would come again tomorrow, the dark would return, the candles, if they ever had one, would be gone, and the hearth would once more be their only star. The Lord's candle was not just a flame, it was a reminder. He had the night, and the peasant, even in their own home, had only the dark.
And it meant purpose. That heavy, inescapable force, because with light came labor. The day did not belong to you, it belonged to the work, and the work never waited. Still, even with that burden, most were grateful. Not for what the day promised, but simply because it was not night. Some even found a kind of beauty in it. Not every morning, but sometimes, after a particularly cruel freeze or a night filled with howling winds and scratching branches, the calm that followed felt sacred, like the world had forgiven them for something, like the light had chosen to return despite everything.
And in those mornings, even the poor stood still, just for a moment, just long enough to let the cold light fall on their faces. They didn't speak, they didn't need to, because they all knew, in the Middle Ages, in the deepest heart of winter, the light always felt like a gift. Fragile, temporary, but real, and they'd need it, because soon enough it would vanish again, and night would return along with its silence, its cold, and its rule over the world. But for now, for this brief hour, they had it, and for peasants and nobles alike, there was no greater power than that. So now, as you sit in a warm room with the soft glow of a screen or the gentle hum of modern life around you, imagine, if only for a moment, what it meant to be awake in a world where light was not a guarantee. Where the night was not just a backdrop, but a living force that pressed against the walls of every home. Where survival was measured not just in food or shelter, but in minutes of flame. The Middle Ages are often painted in broad strokes. Castles and knights, great battles and sweeping plagues. But most people, the ordinary ones, the people whose names never made it into books, lived in silence, in stillness, in the bitter cold and blinding dark. They waited for dawn, not because they were eager for the day's work, but because night was heavy. It sat on their backs, it crept into their sleep, it reminded them of what they did not have. To be poor in medieval winter wasn't just to suffer the cold, it was to surrender your sight, your choices, your time. You measured your life in the hours between dusk and the first grey light.
You huddled close, not for love, but for heat. You watched the coals in your hearth and prayed they would last until morning. There was no electricity to flick on, no phone screen to break the silence. Just the rustle of straw, the groan of wind, and the breath of people too tired to speak. And yet, through that long, hard dark, they endured. Not because they were brave, but because they had no choice. Sometimes, history gets told in explosions, in battles, in revolutions, in sudden turns of fate, but other times it lives in the slow, aching stretch of a winter night, in the way a mother cups a child's frozen hands, in the way a man shares a sliver of candle with his neighbor, in the way people hold on in the dark until the light returns. Because in the end, that's what this story has always been about, not just misery, but resilience. A people shaped by hardship, yes, but not undone by it. People who learned to sleep in shifts, to ration wax and burn rushes, to tell stories in the dark just loud enough to keep fear at bay, to live year after year through winters that wanted to kill them but never quite could. And when the sun finally rose, they got up, again, day after day, winter after winter. And in that quiet defiance we see something timeless. So if this story stayed with you, if the flicker of their fire still glows faintly in your mind, I hope you'll carry it with you as you turn off your own lights tonight. Let it remind you that history isn't always distant. Sometimes it's as close as the dark behind your eyelids. Sleep well, and may the light find you again by morning.
You could feel the year dying in the fields, even before the frost had touched the earth. The tall stalks of barley and wheat, once golden and swaying in the summer breeze, were now cut down, their bundles carefully stacked in dim, draughty barns. These barns were not just storage, they were fragile vaults holding the future itself. But the vaults felt perilous, haunted by a quiet anxiety that seeped into every home. The harvest was a somber affair. There were no cheers, no festive songs. The work was done with careful hands and quiet hearts, knowing that this bounty might not be enough to see them through the long, merciless winter. For every handful of grain tucked away, there was a shadow of doubt. Would it last? Would the cold come early, forcing them to eat sooner? Would rats or damp spoil what little they'd saved? In villages across the countryside, the people moved like ghosts. Men and women, their faces gaunt from months of hardship, shuffled through the fields one last time, searching for stray kernels caught in the straw or fallen to the ground. They bent low, stooping like the earth itself weighed them down, gathering what the machines of harvest had missed. Children, skeletal and pale from hunger, watched in silence. Some tried to help, picking up what they could, but most simply clung close to their mothers, already learning the cruel arithmetic that ruled their lives. Every kernel counted, every crumb rationed. Grain was the heartbeat of the village, the pulse by which survival was measured, It was more precious than gold, more vital than the coins the local lord might hoard in his castle. In those cold, dark months, the strength of a family depended not on bloodline or birthright, but on how well they could guard and stretch their grain stores. Once the harvest was secured, the grain clock began its relentless countdown. There was no mercy, no reprieve. Day after day, handful by handful, the supply dwindled, the shadow of hunger growing longer with each passing dusk. Inside the small cottages, the air smelled of earth and smoke, but also of something thinner, colder, fear. Mothers sat by the hearth, their faces lined with worry, breaking a crust of bread into slivers too small to satisfy, feeding it to their children with trembling hands. Fathers, shoulders stooped from labor and worry, paced quietly, their eyes shadowed as they calculated just how many meals remained. The firelight flickered against walls hung with faded tapestries and patched cloths, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to mimic the hunger that haunted these homes. Often the hearth was the only source of warmth, yet even it could not chase away the gnawing emptiness in bellies. Rats and mice, emboldened by the scent of stored grain, became relentless thieves in the night. Many a family awoke to find a sack gnawed open, their precious stores diminished, their futures dimmer still. There were no pest control remedies beyond traps fashioned from scraps, and the rodents often won these nightly battles. The winter nights were long and cold, and with little food to fuel their bodies, the peasants' strength faded like the dying embers in their hearths. They huddled close beneath threadbare blankets, sharing body heat and whispered prayers. The grain clock dictated more than their meals. It shaped their every movement, every thought, every hope. The villagers knew that every crumb of bread was borrowed time. Stretch it too thin, and their bodies would betray them to weakness, sickness, or despair. Save too much for tomorrow, and tonight's hunger would sharpen into pain. It was a bitter balance, maintained with quiet desperation. And as the snow began to fall, blanketing the fields in cold white, the weight of the grain clock pressed heavier on the people's hearts. Each flake was a reminder that the earth was sleeping, that the cycle had paused, and that the next harvest, and with it, salvation, was still months away. In the stillness, broken only by the howling wind or the creak of frozen timber, families waited. They waited not just for spring, but for survival itself. The grain clock was not just a measure of food, it was a measure of time, fear, endurance, and hope. When the last sheaves of grain were gathered and tucked safely away, the village didn't rejoice. Instead, a heavy, solemn quiet settled over the fields and cottages alike. The work of the harvest had ended, but the battle for survival was only beginning. The grain clock had started its relentless countdown, marking each day, each hour, each meal consumed from the scant stores carefully hoarded against the dark months ahead. The barns and granaries stood like sentinels of fate, their wooden walls weathered and patched from years of wear. Inside, sacks of barley, oats, rye, and wheat rested in the shadowed corners, their contents precious beyond measure. But these vaults were fragile. The threat of damp, mold, and voracious pests like mice and rats was ever present. A single hole in a sack, a forgotten breach in a granary door could mean weeks of hard work and desperate thrift vanishing overnight. The villagers understood this cruel reality better than anyone. Their lives were measured not by days or seasons, but by handfuls of grain. Every kernel was a fragment of hope, a morsel of tomorrow's promise. The harvest might have been bountiful, but it was never enough. The weight of the grain clock pressed down on every shoulder, a constant reminder that the winter ahead was long, dark, and merciless. The women of the village, who bore the heavy burden of feeding their families, took on the grinding of grain with relentless, stoic determination. Without easy access to mills, many turned hand-operated stone querns for hours on end, the coarse grains crushed between cold stones into rough flour. This flour was nothing like the fine white bread enjoyed in the castles or wealthy households. It was dense, heavy, and often tainted with the gritty remnants of husks and chaff. From this coarse flour came bread, dark, thick loaves that were as much about survival as sustenance. Mothers broke the loaves into small rationed pieces, handing out crumbs
with trembling hands, always aware that the supply was shrinking with every meal. The bread was dry and bitter, sometimes mixed with fillers like dried herbs, crushed acorns, or even ground tree bark when desperation deepened. These additives softened the blow of hunger, but never truly filled empty stomachs. Children learned early the meaning of hunger. Their bellies often rumbled louder than the voices around them. Yet they were taught to be quiet, to endure, to share what little they had with siblings and parents alike. The cold bit into their thin clothing and their fragile bodies, but it was the gnawing emptiness of scarcity that truly wore them down. Livestock, too, suffered under winter's relentless grasp. The animals were vital sources of milk, meat, labor, and warmth. But feeding them was a struggle. Fields lay frozen and barren, and the stored hay and straw were quickly depleted. Some families made the agonizing decision to slaughter animals early, preserving meat through salting and smoking, hoping the provisions would stretch long enough to tide them through. Others clung to their herds, even as hunger thinned the animals to shadows of their former selves. The village's social order, already strained by hardship, was held together by fragile threads of cooperation and fear. Grain was power, and those who controlled the granaries, often the lords or wealthy tenants, held sway over the lives of the peasants. While the great halls brimmed with plenty, the cottages were cold and bare. The sight of well-stocked granaries and overflowing feasts in nearby manors stoked resentment and despair in equal measure. Yet open defiance was rare. The medieval world was built on hierarchy and obligation. The peasants understood their place, however harsh it might be. Their survival depended on hard work, obedience, and the hope that the next season would bring mercy. Each evening, as darkness swallowed the village whole, families gathered around the hearth. The firelight flickered weakly against the rough walls, casting long, trembling shadows. Conversations were hushed, voices low, stories careful. These were the moments when time seemed to slow, when the relentless march of the grain clock was felt most keenly.
Storytelling was a vital balm, a way to momentarily escape the harshness of reality. Tales of bountiful harvests past and dreams of the coming spring were shared with quiet hope. But beneath the flicker of candlelight and the warmth of the fire, fear simmered. Would the grain last? Would the family survive? Would the cruel winter take yet another loved one? The daily rationing became a ritual. Carefully measured portions of porridge, thick gruel made from coarse grains, or thin slices of hard bread. Every mouthful was precious. Every meal a careful negotiation with hunger. Families learned to make do with less, to stretch their supplies with whatever filler they could find. Roots, herbs, even crushed bark when the worst came. Pests added to the misery. Rats and mice, drawn by the scent of grain, invaded storage areas nightly. Villagers set traps, used dogs, and sometimes even cats, to fight the invaders, but losses were inevitable. A single hole in a sack meant weeks of food gone. The fight was constant, exhausting, and sometimes desperate. Beyond the physical hunger was the emotional toll, the endless waiting, the grinding monotony of daily survival, and the creeping fear of what the next day might bring weighed heavily on every soul. People huddled close under threadbare blankets, sharing body heat and whispered prayers in the dark. The grain clock wasn't just a measure of food, it was a measure of time, endurance, and hope. With each passing day, the villagers grew more fragile, more desperate, but also more determined. The memory of the earth's bounty was a whisper against the harsh silence of winter, a promise that life would return, that the cycle would turn again. And so they waited, each tick of the grain clock, a reminder of both their fragility and their resilience. Through cold, hunger, and darkness, the villagers endured, because in the Middle Ages, winter was not just a season, it was a trial by fire, a harsh, unforgiving test of survival that shaped every moment of life. As winter nights grew long and the cold seeped into every crevice of the village, an invisible weight settled alongside the physical hardships, a deep, gnawing fear that lived in the shadows. This fear wasn't just born from hunger or the chill. It was woven into the very fabric of medieval life, intensified by darkness and the unknown. In an age before streetlights, before electric bulbs banished the night, darkness was absolute.
Once the sun dipped below the horizon, the world was swallowed whole. The thick black velvet of night covered fields, forests and villages alike, hiding dangers both real and imagined. Villagers knew all too well that darkness was not just the absence of light, it was the cloak of fear. The unknown thrived in this shroud. Strange noises carried through the crisp night air, the howling wind whipping through bare branches, the creaking of old timber under frost's grip, the low growl of distant wolves prowling just beyond the village's edge. Each sound was magnified in the stillness, twisting into threats that stirred uneasy thoughts. Whispers of spirits, demons and witches flourished around hearth fires, passed down through generations. In winter, when life was hardest, the tales grew darker, as if the night itself was listening, waiting. Fear was a constant companion, tangible and ever-present.
For peasants living on the edge of survival, this fear wasn't idle superstition, it was part of their reality. Shadows could hide wolves that might attack livestock, or even people. Cold nights could mask thieves who crept through the dark, stealing grain or firewood to survive. And in a world ruled by faith and mystery, many believed the night was when dark forces roamed freely. In towns and villages, the church sought to wield this fear as both protection and control. Priests and monks preached sermons warning of the devil's work under the cover of night, urging villagers to pray, repent, and adhere strictly to Christian rituals. The threat of hellfire and damnation was as real as the frost on the windows. Witch hunts, although more common in later centuries, had their origins here. Winter, with its biting cold and desperate hunger, was a breeding ground for suspicion. If crops failed, if sickness spread, or if misfortune struck, it was easy to blame dark magic. Those accused, often vulnerable women or outsiders, faced terrifying fates, their supposed crimes whispered in fear and anger in shadowed corners. Yet fear was not only of external forces, it lived within communities. In the cold silence, old grudges simmered, neighbors eyed each other warily, suspicion lurking beneath polite greetings. Every shadow could mask a spy, a thief, or an enemy. The harsh conditions amplified tensions, turning the village into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. This atmosphere seeped into everyday life. Doors were barred early, windows shuttered tight against the night. Fires were kept burning long after dark, not only for warmth, but for a fragile sense of security. But fuel was precious, and as it dwindled, so too did the protection the flames offered. Those without hearth fires or enough wood to keep them burning faced the night alone, a terrifying prospect. They wrapped themselves in rough woolen cloaks, huddling in corners of cold stone rooms, eyes wide against the dark. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, and when sleep fled, the mind wandered into the realms of fear. Medieval people did not experience the night as a single stretch of unconsciousness. Instead, sleep was often broken, segmented, a pattern discussed by scholars but lived by common folk in a very different way. People would wake during the dead hours between midnight and dawn, lie awake in darkness, and sometimes rise to tend fires, check on animals, or even visit neighbors. But these waking hours were also the time when fear was sharpest. Lying in bed, hearing every creak and whisper, imagination took hold. What if the shadows hiding beyond the window were not just trees or snowdrifts? What if they were something worse? What if a witch or demon prowled the village, waiting for the right moment to strike? Children especially were vulnerable to these fears. Mothers soothed trembling limbs and whispered prayers to guard against evil, but the shadows were patient and relentless. For the little ones, night could be a place of terror, a never-ending test of courage. Adults were no less affected. Fatigue from cold, hunger and hard labor dulled their bodies, but left their minds alert to the dangers lurking unseen. The night was a time of vulnerability, when illness could strike unnoticed, when injuries from the day's work worsened without care. The fear that lived in the shadows was a force that shaped the medieval psyche, embedding caution, superstition, and ritual into daily existence. It was why communities gathered around fires, why churches rang bells at night, why prayers were murmured under their breath. But it also created isolation. Each person, while bound together by common fears, was also alone with their own terrors. The darkness was a wall between them, an invisible barrier that separated the safety of light from the uncertainty of night.
In this way, winter's misery wasn't just about cold or hunger, it was about the invisible weight of fear pressing on hearts and minds, a constant reminder that in the Middle Ages, darkness was more than just night. It was a ruler, a master who governed how people lived, slept, and hoped for dawn. And as the long winter stretched on, the shadows grew deeper, the fears sharper, and the promise of morning light felt both distant and desperately needed.
In the modern world, we think of sleep as a long, uninterrupted block, 8 hours, maybe 7 or 6, ideally in a warm, quiet room with soft bedding and cozy blankets. But in the Middle Ages, especially during those bleak winter months, sleep followed a very different rhythm. It was segmented, fractured, and dictated as much by the cold and the darkness as by human biology. The idea of a single solid night's sleep is a relatively modern luxury. Back then, people commonly experienced what historians and sleep scholars now call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. Instead of drifting into a single deep slumber, villagers would enter a first sleep shortly after nightfall. This initial sleep might last 3 to 4 hours, long enough to drift into dreams, but never deep enough to fully escape the biting cold or the harshness of their surroundings. Then, often in the dead of night, between what we now consider midnight and 3 or 4 a.m., they would awaken. This was the watch, or the second sleep. But waking was not a disturbance, it was an expected, accepted part of the night, a natural pause in rest. It was during this time that much of the unspoken, unseen life of the village stirred. For many peasants, waking at night wasn't a peaceful transition. The chill in the air bit through thin woolen clothes, and the fire that had kept their beds warm had often burned low or gone out completely. Without the comfort of blankets and the warmth of a hearth, the cold was immediate and relentless. Still, rising in the middle of the night was both practical and necessary. In the long, dark winter, the dangers of cold and hunger were ever present. Fires had to be tended or rekindled, especially if the household's supply of firewood was scarce. A dying hearth meant plunging back into freezing cold. Those living in thatched cottages, made of wood and mud walls, were poorly insulated. Heat escaped as quickly as it was generated. So during this midnight wakefulness, it was common for villagers to dress in layers of wool and linen, stoke the fire back to life, and tend to household chores that couldn't be left unattended. Sometimes it meant checking on livestock, cows, sheep or chickens, who themselves faced the dangers of cold and predators lurking in the night. A single frozen calf or a fox taking a chicken could mean weeks of hardship. Beyond these necessities, this time was filled with quieter activities, ones that flickered between survival and solace. Some people would engage in private prayer, murmuring petitions for safety and the coming dawn. Religious devotion was a cornerstone of medieval life, especially in the lonely hours of night when the world seemed most fragile and uncertain. Candles, precious and rationed, were lit carefully to provide a small pool of light in the dark. Others might sit quietly, spinning wool or repairing clothes by the faint glow of candlelight. These small acts were a way to pass the time, a way to keep hands busy and minds off the hunger gnawing at empty stomachs. Needlework, mending torn garments or even carving small wooden objects provided a fragile sense of control over a life dictated by forces beyond their reach. The night also invited moments of social connection, albeit limited. Families sometimes gathered near the fire to exchange whispers, share stories or comfort frightened children. Unlike the broad socializing of daylight, these gatherings were hushed, intimate, and fraught with the ever-present chill of winter and the threat of darkness. Interestingly, the segmented sleep pattern itself may have evolved as a practical adaptation to these conditions. The cold and darkness made continuous deep sleep difficult, and waking in the middle of the night offered opportunities to care for family and home in a way that daylight hours, filled with labor, could not accommodate. For some, the quiet night was a chance to escape daily hardship, even if only for a brief while. The second sleep, for instance, might allow a moment to reflect, to dream, or to pray. These were hours of stillness, when the village seemed suspended between past and future, light and dark, life and death. But this midnight wakefulness was also a time fraught with anxiety. The darkness was filled with fears of theft, wild animals, supernatural dangers, or the simple but terrifying threat of illness striking unnoticed. The village was isolated, and aid was a distant hope.
If a child cried out in pain or an elderly family member grew worse during the night, there was no quick call for help.
Sleep was precious, but never guaranteed. This broken sleep cycle, combined with the ever-present cold and hunger, meant that medieval people faced winter nights with a weariness that seeped deep into their bones. Fatigue was constant. The long hours of darkness robbed them of restorative rest and stole vital energy. Every morning felt like a battle against the exhaustion that winter so mercilessly imposed. In a time when daily survival depended on physical strength, for chopping wood, tending animals, repairing homes and working the fields when frost allowed, this chronic lack of restful sleep amplified winter's misery exponentially. Yet, the segmented sleep cycle also shaped the cultural and spiritual life of the Middle Ages. These waking hours between sleeps were often considered sacred or liminal, a threshold between the worlds of waking and dreaming, of the earthly and the divine. Some medieval texts reference the watch of the night as a time of prayer and meditation, when one's soul was thought to be particularly open to divine messages or protection. Monks in monasteries kept vigil during these hours, chanting psalms and lighting candles to stave off the darkness, both physical and spiritual. For common folk too, the second sleep was a time to reflect, to hope, and to find small moments of peace amid hardship. However, the reality remained harsh. The chill, the hunger, and the ever-present shadow of fear made these hours among the hardest. The long winter nights could feel like an endless loop of broken rest and vigil, a cycle that wore down body and spirit alike. Yet despite the relentless cold and the pressing darkness, people adapted. The segmented sleep became a rhythm of resilience, a way to survive, not only physically, but mentally, through the cruelest season. As dawn finally broke, the long night's watch gave way to the first light, and the village stirred to life once again, each person carrying the weight of the night behind their eyes, but pressing forward, driven by the hope that the cold would one day release its grip, and that light would finally return to warm both the earth and their weary souls.
Winter in the Middle Ages was more than just a season. It was a slow, grinding test of endurance, a merciless trial that invaded every aspect of life, not least the mind. The physical pain of hunger was only the surface of a deeper torment. Hunger in those dark months clawed its way into thoughts, memories and emotions, changing the very fabric of a person's identity. The ache in the belly was relentless, but even worse was how starvation reshaped the way people saw the world and themselves. Imagine waking day after day to an emptiness that is not just physical but mental. The chill that seeped through thin woolen clothing was nothing compared to the coldness that settled in the mind. Hunger sharpened the senses but also dulled hope. Thoughts became repetitive, circling endlessly around the next meal, the last crust of bread, or where one might find a stray root or nut to stave off starvation for just a few more hours. The mind narrowed as if a funnel had squeezed all other concerns out of existence, leaving only the singular focus of survival. This mental narrowing was a survival mechanism, yes, but it came with a heavy price. The world beyond the pressing need for food seemed to recede. Community life, once rich with social ties, stories, laughter, and shared work, grew muted and fragile. Long conversations were replaced by silence or terse exchanges, as energy drained from bodies and spirits alike. The warmth of human connection, vital for enduring hardship, grew scarce, replaced by a brittle tension as everyone struggled with their own hunger. Stories handed down from medieval villages speak of what was called the hungry madness. This wasn't madness in the sense of insanity, but a profound transformation that hunger brought about. People who were once generous, patient and kind found those qualities slipping away, replaced by suspicion, irritability, and sometimes outright cruelty. Desperation drove neighbors apart and frayed the bonds of trust that held communities together. The moral compass, once steady, wavered and spun in the harsh winds of famine. Memory itself became fragile under the strain of starvation. The endless, monotonous winter days blurred together, becoming a dark fog in the minds of those who endured them. Important details, like where the last hidden stores were buried, or which neighbor might have a secret stash of grain, slipped away in the haze of exhaustion and hunger. This loss of clarity could be deadly. Forgetting crucial information meant missing opportunities to survive. Yet, even as some memories faded, others burned fiercely into the minds of survivors, the faces of those who succumbed to famine, the cries of starving children, the dreadful silence that followed death. These became permanent shadows haunting the living. The trauma was not just personal but collective. Villages and families carried these memories like scars, teaching future generations the harsh lessons of scarcity and survival. These stories, passed from mouth to ear, shaped the culture and identity of medieval communities, anchoring the fear and respect for winter's deadly grasp. The behavioral changes hunger induced were profound and heartbreaking. Acts that would have been unthinkable in times of abundance became grim necessities. Stealing food was one such act. While theft was condemned both by law and the church, famine forced many into desperate choices. Taking a handful of grain from a neighbor's barn or sneaking scraps from the church's granary was a gamble, a risk between survival and punishment. For some, this theft sparked feuds, bloodshed, and deep rifts that lasted long after the winter thawed. The strain of hunger sometimes even fractured families. Parents were forced into unimaginable decisions: who would eat and who would not. These choices, made in the cold silence of a starving household, left wounds that could never fully heal. Love was tested in the crucible of famine, and some families emerged scarred by mistrust and sorrow. Hunger also led people to break taboos. Foods once considered unclean, rats, bark, rotten meat, were consumed out of sheer necessity. Even scavenging for scraps in refuse heaps or eating boiled leather became part of survival. These acts carried a heavy emotional toll. Shame, fear, and despair accompanied every bite, adding a mental burden atop physical weakness. The phrase "hungry madness" captured this fracturing of the mind, the moment when survival instincts overwhelmed reason, social norms, and morality. Religion played a crucial role in how people made sense of their suffering. Hunger was often seen as a sign from God, a test of faith, a punishment for sins, or a form of purification. This spiritual interpretation added another layer of complexity to the psychological toll. Enduring hunger was not just a physical ordeal, but a spiritual trial, one that demanded patience, humility, and hope for divine mercy.
But it also bred guilt. If famine was punishment, then those who stole, lied, or fought to survive bore the burden of sin. Confession was both a relief and a reminder of human frailty. The church preached charity, but many peasants felt abandoned or judged, their suffering compounded by spiritual doubt and fear of damnation. This spiritual anguish fed the mental torment that hunger wrought. Hunger changed who people were on a fundamental level. Some became hardened by the experience, pragmatic and ruthless, willing to cross lines they never would have before. Others succumbed to despair, retreating into silence and hopelessness. These internal shifts echoed outward, reshaping social dynamics and community life. Survivors returned from winter changed, carrying scars not visible but deeply felt. The trauma left behind by famine shaped generations. Families passed down survival strategies born of desperation and loss, but also a cautiousness born of pain. The memory of hunger tempered generosity and festivity, creating a culture marked by carefulness around food and resources. In this way, winter's misery extended far beyond the months of snow and cold, seeping into the very soul of medieval life.
The end of winter in the Middle Ages did not arrive like a sudden, glorious unveiling of sunlight and warmth. Rather, it came slowly, almost reluctantly, like a faint whisper of hope through the endless grey. For peasants who had endured months of cold and hunger, the final stretch of winter nights was often the hardest. The long darkness lingered stubbornly, stretching into mornings where the light still felt weak and tentative, offering little comfort to frozen bodies and exhausted minds. As dawn approached after the long, cold nights, it was not a triumphant arrival, but a cautious, gentle creeping of light that barely pierced the heavy mist and frost. For those who had lived through the merciless grip of winter's darkest days, the first faint rays of morning brought a bittersweet relief. It was a relief mixed with fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. The night was not just an absence of light, it was a presence itself, a heavy, oppressive force that had ruled over their lives. The slow retreat of darkness signaled survival, but also reminded peasants of all they had lost. For the poorest, those who lived in cramped huts with barely enough food to fill empty stomachs, the return of light meant little in practical terms. The fields lay barren beneath patches of melting snow, the grain stores already depleted, offered no fresh hope. Many families emerged from winter weakened, some not at all. Starvation, illness and cold had claimed the lives of neighbors, friends and family members. The community that greeted spring was smaller, quieter, and forever changed. The long months of scarcity left an imprint not only on the body, but on the spirit. Peasants carried the memories of hunger like an ache behind their eyes. They remembered the sound of children crying in the night from hunger pangs that could not be soothed, the shame of begging for scraps, the desperate barter for meager rations. The end of winter was no grand celebration for many, but a cautious, weary continuation of survival. As the sun rose each morning, it revealed the harsh reality. Winter's misery had not simply vanished with the snow. The cold might relent, but the damage remained. Fields lay fallow and planting could not begin until the earth thawed fully. For those dependent on the land, this waiting period was filled with anxiety. Would this year's harvest be better? Would the food stores last until the first crops came in? The uncertainty was a heavy companion, a shadow cast long even by the morning light. The slow arrival of spring also brought renewed burdens. The weakened bodies of peasants were more vulnerable to disease, which thrived in the damp, muddy conditions of early spring. Survivors of winter's famine faced malnutrition that left them susceptible to fevers, coughs and infections that their fragile bodies could barely fight off. Death did not pause with the thaw. It often followed in the months after winter, sweeping through villages like a lingering shadow.
Yet, despite the hardships, the return of light carried a quiet power. It signaled the possibility of renewal, of a life beyond the cruel winter. People looked to the sunrise with a mix of hope and exhaustion. The light brought the promise of work, ploughing fields, sowing seeds, repairing homes damaged by storms and frost. For peasants, the rhythms of life were deeply tied to these natural cycles. The light was a call back to labor, to rebuilding what the harsh months had torn down. The contrast between night and day was stark in medieval life. When the long night ruled, freedom was severely limited. Darkness was a barrier, a boundary that confined people to their homes, cold and cramped, with little to eat and fewer comforts. But with dawn came a slow unlocking of the world. Doors opened, voices rose, and the village stirred from its winter slumber. Children stepped outside to play in the muddy streets, and animals were led out to pasture. The light restored a sense of agency, of life pressing forward despite hardship. Still, the scars of winter's misery lingered. Many peasants lived in fear that the cold might return suddenly, that another frost might wipe out their fragile crops. Food shortages from winter were often not fully erased until the new harvest in late summer. The early months of spring were a liminal space, halfway between survival and hope, marked by fragility and caution. In their hearts, peasants understood this slow end to winter as a test not yet over. The light was not yet a victory, but a fragile truce in a long battle against nature's cruelty. The experience of waiting for dawn, of watching darkness slowly yield, was a meditation on endurance itself. It was a time of reflection, of preparing for the hard work ahead, and of quietly mourning those lost along the way. This gradual return of light and life shaped medieval culture deeply. Festivals and holy days often marked the changing seasons, celebrations that honored not just the earth, but the resilience of the people. Yet beneath the feasts and prayers lay the memory of those winters past, of hunger, loss, and the cruel reign of darkness. The shadow of winter's misery was never far from the warmth of spring's first light. For the peasants, winter was more than a season. It was a harsh ruler that governed their lives, shaped their minds, and tested their spirits. The slow end of night was a reminder that even as the cold receded, the scars of winter's darkness endured, woven into the fabric of their very existence. In the heart of winter, when the world outside transformed into a frozen wasteland, and the wind howled like a hungry beast at the door, the cellar was a sanctuary. It stood in silent contrast to the chaos of the elements, offering warmth, sustenance, and a sense of calm. To the medieval peasant, the cellar was not merely a space to store food. It was a sacred place of survival, a quiet bastion of hope, and a living archive of memories and traditions passed down through generations.
The typical medieval root cellar was a humble but ingenious construction, often hewn into the earth beneath the family home or an adjoining barn. Far from being an afterthought, it was a deliberate architectural feature. Its design reflected centuries of practical wisdom. Thick stone walls or tightly packed earth insulated the space, maintaining a steady, cool temperature year-round. High humidity levels prevented stored foods from drying out, while darkness preserved the freshness of fruits and vegetables. This carefully managed microclimate allowed perishable goods to remain edible for months, extending the bounty of the harvest well into the lean winter months. The entrance to the cellar was usually modest, marked by a small, low-hung door, sometimes even a double-door system designed to keep out the bitter cold and wild animals. A few wooden steps led down into the cool depths, where rows of shelves, bins, and hanging racks lined the walls. Despite its simplicity, the cellar was meticulously organized. Each section was devoted to a different category of goods. Earthy root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, and carrots were packed into bins filled with sawdust or straw to absorb excess moisture. Hardier greens like cabbages and squashes were stacked on open shelves. Smoked hams and salted pork hung from ceiling hooks, and rows of jars gleamed with preserved fruits, pickled vegetables, and sauces. This space was not created in isolation. It was the culmination of centuries of agricultural and domestic knowledge. The ability to preserve food effectively could mean the difference between life and death, particularly in a time when harvests were uncertain and winters could be long and unforgiving. Preservation techniques such as drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and pickling were handed down from generation to generation. Families developed and refined their own methods, tailored to the regional climate and available resources. These weren't just skills, they were survival tools, passed like heirlooms from parent to child, ensuring continuity through the harshest of seasons.
As autumn waned and the first frosts kissed the fields, the ritual of preparing the cellar began in earnest. Harvest season was not just a time of gathering, it was a time of intense labor and sacred rhythm. Families worked together to sort and process their bounty. Only the most pristine fruits and vegetables were selected for long-term storage. Bruised apples were sliced and dried near the hearth or pressed into cider. Softer cabbages were shredded and salted to ferment into sauerkraut, and overripe plums might be stewed into preserves or dried for winter pies. This was not solitary work. In many villages, the labor of preparing and storing food for winter was a communal affair. Neighbors would gather to butcher animals, smoke meats, and share preservation methods. Women exchanged recipes for pickling and fermenting, while men assisted with heavy lifting and construction. There was a deep sense of interdependence. Everyone relied on everyone else. The cellar, therefore, was not just a family space, but a reflection of community effort. It represented shared labor, mutual support, and the collective wisdom of the people. The cellar also bore silent witness to the passing of time. Within its cool depths, the seasonal cycles were etched into every jar and bundle, every layer of sawdust, every hanging sausage, every neatly stacked bin of vegetables told a story, not only of the present harvest, but of past winters endured and ancestors remembered. The cellar was, in many ways, a family's living history. Grandparents might speak of the harsh winter of their youth, how a single root cellar kept them alive, or how a special jar of cherries had been opened for a wedding feast. Children, too, were initiated into the rituals and responsibilities of the cellar from a young age. They learned to distinguish the telltale signs of spoilage, to rotate older items to the front, and to treat the food stores with reverence. This space served as an early classroom in practical wisdom and resilience. It was where young minds were taught the vital relationship between planning, patience, and survival. Lessons were rarely delivered as lectures. They were lived and learned by doing. A child might remember the sting of cold air on their cheeks as they carried a bucket of turnips up the steps, or the thrill of tasting dried apples stored since the fall. But the cellar's significance extended beyond the physical and the practical. It was a place of profound psychological comfort. In a world dominated by uncertainty, famine, and harsh weather, the sight of a well-stocked cellar could lift even the heaviest heart. While snowstorms raged above and firewood dwindled, the cellar promised continuity. It whispered assurances of spring, of abundance yet to come. Even when the days were short and the nights unbearably cold, a single candle lit in the cellar could reveal a world of plenty. The warm glow reflecting off glass jars, the earthy smell of root vegetables, the quiet drip of melted snow from above. There were, of course, times when the cellar felt like a last defense against despair. In years when crops failed or disease swept through livestock, the cellar's stores grew thin. Families rationed more strictly, and each visit became a somber exercise in calculation and hope. But even then, it remained a beacon. It reminded those who entered of their own endurance, of the possibility of survival. It held the promise that if they could just hold on, just make it through this season, the earth would thaw and life would return. Despite the passage of centuries and the rise of modern conveniences, the traditions of the root cellar have not entirely disappeared. In many rural communities across Europe and North America, root cellars are still in use today. Homesteaders and small-scale farmers continue to build them, not out of nostalgia but out of practicality and respect for time-tested methods. These modern cellars are often accompanied by family stories, recipes written in fading ink, and techniques shared at kitchen tables. They serve as living links to ancestors who relied on the same principles of preparation and perseverance. In a time when much of our food comes pre-packaged and our winters are tamed by central heating, the medieval root cellar remains a symbol of something deeper. It represents a connection to the land, a respect for the seasons, and an understanding that true security lies not in abundance, but in foresight, knowledge, and community. The cellar reminds us that while we may no longer fear the wolf at the door in quite the same way, the values that carried our ancestors through the darkest winters, resilience, cooperation, and hope, are as vital now as they were then. So, the next time you see a jar of homemade preserves or a bunch of carrots pulled from cool soil, remember the cellar. Remember the hands that built it, the families that depended on it, and the quiet strength it symbolized. For in that small, dark space beneath the earth lived the heart of a people who, through hardship and endurance, taught us the true meaning of survival. Even when the snow finally began to melt, not everyone made it. The earth softened in slow degrees. First came the slush and filth of thaw, mud thick as porridge that sucked at boots and hooves alike. Then, buds returned hesitantly to the bare branches, as if unsure whether the cold was truly finished with them. Lambs were born on damp straw, and their thin cries pierced the stillness like a hymn. Yet for many, spring was no deliverance. It came too late. In the village of Elmbrook, a place like many others scattered across the medieval landscape, there were families who opened their cellar doors in March only to find nothing left. Not a turnip, not a single shriveled apple. The candles burned low and the firewood was gone. By then, even the bones had been boiled more than once. Mara, the miller's wife, sat motionless beside the hearth as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Her 3 children stared blankly from the bench opposite. Her youngest, Elswith, had died 2 weeks before the thaw, her body unable to withstand one more freezing night with an empty stomach. They had buried her just beyond the fence, in the ground still half frozen. The grave was shallow, but there had been no strength left for digging. Mara's husband had said nothing since. Spring, they had always been told, would bring rebirth, but for those left behind, it brought only silence, the silence of too many missing voices. The fields were still barren, the livestock thin and nervous, and the bread baked now was no longer bitter only in taste, but in memory. The old believed in cycles. As sure as the winter comes, the spring must follow, they would say. But what no one said aloud, what everyone knew in their bones, was that the winter also took its toll in debts that spring could not pay. The strong returned to the fields, yes, but they were fewer now. Bent backs were bent lower, the stoop of starvation did not straighten easily, and illness lingered in the lungs and blood. Children who had survived the cold now faced a different fight: rickets, infections, and fever. Their bellies still ached even with food returning to the table. The cellar, once a symbol of survival and foresight, now reminded people of failure. Not of individual failure, but of a system stretched too thin. Even the best prepared households had suffered. A single poor harvest, an early frost, or a failed salting batch,
was enough to tip the balance. Survival had always been a game of margins, of cruel math. That winter, the math hadn't worked out for many. And yet, somehow, life went on. In April, the village gathered in the church for the feast of St. Mark. It had always been a small, joyful occasion in years past, marked by prayers for growing crops and the health of livestock. This year, it was more funeral than feast. The priest read a list of the dead aloud. So many names, most met with silence. A few met with gasps when someone learned of a neighbour's death weeks too late. Afterward, as the congregation trickled into the muddy churchyard, heads were bowed not in reverence but in exhaustion. Old Willem, who had survived more winters than anyone else in Elmbrook, stood by the wall near the cemetery gate. He watched the people go, one hand resting on the stone as if steadying himself against the world. "Not enough meat, not enough salt," he muttered to no one in particular. "We used to share more. That's the truth of it. We shared more when we had less." A boy nearby overheard him. He looked up, his cheeks still sunken from months of hunger. "We didn't have anything to share." Willem looked at him, eyes glistening. A crust is still a crust when you break it in half, and a warm fire shared is warmer still. You'll remember that next time, because there's always a next time. It was hard for the living to speak of hope, not when so many had died just days or weeks before salvation arrived. But old folks like Willem understood what others tried not to admit. Survival was not guaranteed just because the snows melted. The worst winters did not always end with the season. Their ghosts lingered. For Mara, survival had become a daily ritual of guilt and gratitude. Every bowl of broth brought relief, and every bite reminded her of Ellsworth's empty chair. She sometimes found herself dividing meals in her mind into 4 parts instead of 3, catching her mistake and swallowing tears with her food. She kept the little girl's shoes beside the hearth, unable to move them. When spring rain fell in earnest, Mara ventured to the fields. She was weak but determined. She dug with stiff fingers, planting what she could, onions, leeks, and the last of the seed potatoes. The rhythm of it, the feel of earth crumbling between her fingers, gave her back something she hadn't realized she'd lost: purpose. Others returned to work too. Tom the blacksmith, who had lost his brother to fever, resumed his forge with a limp from frostbite. The baker's hands shook as he kneaded dough, and the bread was heavy and uneven for weeks. But the oven glowed once more. There were some, however, who never returned to full strength. The winter had hollowed them out too deeply. They walked more slowly, they spoke less. They carried the season inside them like a second skin. It was not only physical weakness that held people back. Many carried grief in silence. There were no proper funerals for most of the dead, no time to mourn amid the need to survive. People had watched loved ones slip away beside them and had done nothing, not because they didn't care, but because there had been nothing to do. And yet, amidst all this, small joys crept in on silent feet. The children, those who had survived, chased one another barefoot through the first green shoots of grass. They laughed with abandon, as if to reclaim a bit of what had been lost. Their laughter startled birds from hedgerows and lifted heads among weary adults. The village women began to sing again while working, not loudly at first, but in half-hummed verses, remembered lines of old songs that came back with the sunlight. They sewed, they mended, and in the act of making whole they healed. Willem began carving a new cross for the gravesite, one tall enough to mark all who had died that winter, not just his own kin. Others brought stones and offerings, tokens of memory and thanks, a ribbon, a carving, a child's toy. The graveyard, like the cellar, became a place where past and future met. By early May, the woods around Elmbrook turned thick with green. Birds returned in earnest, and the bees buzzed drunkenly among the blossoming apple trees. The market path reopened, and for the first time in months, traders came with sacks of grain and wheels of cheese. Prices were high, too high for many, but the mere sight of trade was heartening. Still, behind every full basket and every new lamb was a tally of those not there to see it. The cruelest truth of winter was not that it killed, but that it did so quietly, slowly. It wore people down like water against stone, and when spring came, the world didn't mourn them.
It bloomed without apology. Even so, life insisted on continuing. The cellars were restocked slowly. New rows of pickles and preserves began to take shape by midsummer. Not as full as before, but enough. The people of Elmbrook now measured enough, not by abundance, but by survival. If you had something to set aside for the next winter, you were lucky. If you could still sing while doing it, you were blessed. They knew now what winter could take. And they knew, too, that spring would not save everyone.
But they also knew this: they had made it. And for the living, that was reason enough to begin again. The story of a medieval winter is not just one of snow and silence, of empty bellies and frostbitten hands. It is a story of balance between abundance and absence, preparation and desperation, life and death. In those long months of cold and scarcity, every decision mattered. Every mistake cost dearly. Every victory was small, hard-won, and often invisible. Bitter bread is what they called it. Bread stretched too thin, cut too small, eaten too fast. Bread that fed bodies but left hearts hollow. Yet even in its bitterness it nourished, because it meant someone had survived long enough to eat it. Winter exposed the cruel math of peasant life, where survival wasn't measured by hope or effort alone, but by circumstance. How much was harvested, how well the cellar held, how deep the frost bit, how early spring arrived. These people did not control the seasons or the soil, only how they met them. And still, they endured. Not everyone made it. The cost was heavy. Families changed. Names were lost. Stories ended in silence. Yet even in that loss, something powerful remained. The will to continue. The act of planting again after a winter of death was, in itself, an act of defiance, a quiet, stubborn kind of faith. The root cellar stands as the emblem of that faith, cold and dark, but filled with the warmth of memory and the promise of tomorrow. In its stillness lived all the lessons of survival: foresight, labor, tradition, and resilience. And above it, life went on. The bread rose again, the children played, the seeds took root. The hunger never left entirely. It lingered in the bones, in memory, in the way people measured out flour more carefully or saved a crust for later. But that hunger shaped them, sharpened them. It made the people more than mere victims of winter. It made them architects of survival. And so, this is not just a tale of suffering. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the wisdom carved from cold, to the lives built season by season from the brittle edge of hardship, to bitter bread and the hands that baked it anyway. If you've made it this far, thank you. This is a new channel, and I'm just beginning to build something I hope will grow into a meaningful space, where stories like this are told with care, depth, and heart. Whether you're here because you love history, storytelling, or just something a little different, I'm really glad you're with me. If you enjoyed this and want to walk further into the past with me, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or just saying hi. Every bit of support helps bring the next story to life. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and take care of one another.